Around the world today, there are few weapons as recognizable as the infamous AK-47. To some, it's a symbol of oppression, to others, freedom. A rifle that is so ingrained in the psyche of the world, yet whose origin is surrounded in mystery. But how did a Soviet tank sergeant with no formal training or schooling in manufacturing help create the world's most prolific weapon? And how has its decades-old design remained current? At the end of World War II, the people of the Soviet Union were feeling a mix of emotions. On one hand, they were joyous that the deadliest conflict in history was over, but on the other, they were cautious. The Soviet government vowed that no foreign power would ever invade Russian soil again. They ensured so by not only claiming over a dozen satellite states in Eastern Europe, but by investing heavily in their defense industry. By this time, the Soviets, along with the rest of the world, realized the inferiority of bolt-action rifles. Bolt-action rifles, such as the Russian Mosin Nagant, were deadly accurate and packed a huge punch, but they severely limited the rate of fire of soldiers as well as the amount of ammunition they could carry. Soviet designers had already been experimenting for years to develop a weapon that could give the average soldier a fire rate of a machine gun, but the accuracy of a rifle. All of that would change with the prototypes of Mikhail Kalashnikov. Kalashnikov spent most of his formative years in the harsh winters of Siberia. It was probably here that he learned the value of being able to operate equipment in the most extreme environments. In his early teens, in search of a better life and work outside of his native Siberia, Kalashnikov took over a 500-mile journey in search of work. He finally found a job at a tractor factory and showed so much promising skill that he was allowed to work with the local Red Army unit to fit rifles into their stocks at the armory. From here, he was drafted into the Tank Corps in 1938, and when Hitler invaded Russia, he found himself caught up in some of the largest battles of the war. After barely escaping a battle with his life in the fall of 1941, Kalashnikov was recovering from his wounds in a hospital when he heard frequent complaints from fellow soldiers about the reliability and capability of their current infantry weapons. Wanting to help answer their problems, he immediately set upon developing a reliable and accurate automatic weapon upon his discharge. Soviet authorities ultimately rejected his first design of a new submachine gun. However, this project was not in vain, since he did gain their respect and admiration that someone with no formal education could create such an impressive prototype. He was then given a job helping develop new small arms and ammunition for the Soviet military. His first breakthrough came in 1944 when he designed the ammunition for the AK-47, the 7.62 by 39mm cartridge. This cartridge was groundbreaking in that it had a low enough charge to not produce too much recoil, but had enough weight to give it a fairly straight flight path and medium to long range. The weight and recoil are important since this would enable users to sustain accurate, fully automatic fire while also being able to carry large amounts of ammunition into battle. Then, just after the end of World War II, one of the country's most famous weapon designers became ill. Alexei Sadayev had grown to national fame throughout the war by helping design a new submachine gun during the siege of Leningrad when surrounded by the Germans in starving conditions. The weapon is credited with greatly increasing the firepower of Soviet soldiers and helping defeat the Germans there. This feat made him a national hero, and the Soviet government asked him to develop a full-scale automatic rifle. Sadayev's first design, the AS-44, was determined adequate but too heavy. He was asked to make another design, but his illness caught up with him and he passed away in 1946. Not wanting to stall weapons development after the loss of Russia's most celebrated gun designers, the Soviet authorities decided to hold a competition. They solicited any and all interested in the army of gun designers currently employed by the government to submit their best proposals. Desiring the incredible cash prize and prestige that would come with winning such a contest, Kalashnikov decided to enter. Contrary to popular belief, he was not working by himself, but instead had an entire design team behind him, including a woman who helped put his ideas into technically accurate sketches. The team worked hard and they faced fierce competition. There were originally over 15 competitors all vying to have their designs picked up. Because there were so many interested, the competition was held in phases, with more and more competitors being eliminated as their weapons went through a series of trials by the government. The contest was held in secret, and for good reason. In many similar contests of the past, those who had more established names might have been more inclined to be selected in order to please Stalin, but Stalin only wanted the best product this time, so each of the competitors was given a pseudonym, and the members of the commission judging the contest did not know who was producing the firearms. Throughout the competition, one feature about Kalashnikov's design made it stand out from the rest: its loose tolerances. Most weapons of the day were designed with what were called tight tolerances, meaning all the parts and pieces fit tightly together. Kalashnikov's team did the opposite by purposefully designing a rifle with loose tolerances, which allowed for foreign debris like mud, sand, and water to enter the rifle, and it would still work. This ruggedness and reliability would propel it to the final stage of the competition. But before the final stage could begin in 1947, the 3 remaining designs were all required to go back to the drawing board to work out some of the kinks the commission had identified in each one. Kalashnikov was told the rifle was too heavy, so he shortened the barrel significantly and also made his most significant design change to date. He combined the bolt carrier and the gas piston into one unit. By doing so, he eliminated the number of parts needed, which made manufacturing, repairing, and cleaning much easier. It was this rugged system combined with the loose tolerances that would eventually cement the AK-47's legendary reputation. Kalashnikov and his partners made 3 new models of their latest design. As the legend goes, when they took it to the final test and disassembled and reassembled it for the judges, his competitors respectfully bowed out of the competition, realizing that his design was so far superior to anything they had produced. While this version of events is the subject of much debate and controversy as to if it actually happened or not, what is certain is that Kalashnikov's design won the competition and was soon put into mass production for the Soviet Army by 1948. Hence, the infamous AK-47 was born. Despite all of its technological advances and superior design, that alone does not explain how the AK-47 became the world's most prolific and iconic assault rifle. How the AK-47 got there was because of a mix of politics and idealists, as well as opportune timing during the Cold War. The Cold War was not just focused on building a bigger and better nuclear weapon. Sure, these were more significant as they could cause mutually assured annihilation on both sides, but many simultaneous arms races were going on for conventional weapons as well. Tanks, planes, missiles, and even infantry small arms were all trying to one-up each other. The AK-47 fell right into the middle of this all by being able to be produced cheaply and rapidly. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Soviet Union was the standard bearer for communism in the world. As a result, they felt obligated to help out any fledgling communist insurgency or country they could by all means available. One of their best methods was by flooding a friendly nation with AK-47 rifles. The idea was twofold. Firstly, it provided much-needed military aid at little cost and would ensure interoperability with Soviet troops in the future since they used the same weapons and ammunition. By supplying their own weapons to communist states, the Soviet Union was also forcing them to continue to remain an ally since they would have to rely on the Russians to provide a continual supply of ammunition, spare parts, and replacement rifles. The Soviets also had a political victory through the proliferation of the AK-47. By much of the world using the rifle, especially the vulnerable third world or unaligned countries, they could claim that Soviet engineering was superior to the West and they had beaten Western defense industries. It also helped boost public opinion of the regime at home. The Soviet Union was not necessarily known for its high-quality manufactured goods. Often, most household and domestic goods were far inferior quality to those produced in the West. By having a reliable arms industry that could claim victory over Western products, the home industrial base could gain much-needed public confidence. Despite Russia's desire to flood the world with as many AK-47s as possible, they were optimistically cautious to continue improving the design to keep pace with Western developments. During the first set of Army trials in 1948, some major changes were made. The ejector was redesigned and the return spring was thickened to make it more durable. Other smaller changes included recasting and changing the handle into a crescent shape. The next biggest development in the AK-47 came in the form of its receiver. The receiver is the main body of the rifle where the trigger group, bolt assembly, and magazine well are located. Kalashnikov's original design was a stamped receiver. That means a piece of sheet metal is stamped into a mold for a part. Doing so drastically cuts down costs by reducing time and labor. But when Soviet authorities started to mass-produce the rifle, they realized that creating stamped receivers in large quantities was not possible at the time for Soviet technology. To compromise, they had to redesign the AK-47 receiver with the classic but more expensive method of milling. Milling involves taking a solid block of steel and grinding it down into a receiver. Milled receivers have much tighter tolerances than their stamped counterparts have, but take much longer to produce, driving up costs and limiting production capacity. It would take years for Soviet technology to finally adapt to producing a cost-effective and efficient stamped receiver. But in the meantime, the country had militaries to arm and revolutions to ignite. Probably the most substantial boost to the AK-47 production was the formation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955. This 8-country alliance, in response to the creation of NATO, dictated that any country attacked would elicit a response from the others. The agreement also stated that these countries would fall under a unified command by a Russian general and would be supplied with the same arms and ammunition, the AK-47. but the Soviet Union simply could not produce the number of weapons needed to arm all these countries. After all, the Russians at the time only operated 2 factories for their whole military. As a result, each of these countries was granted licenses to produce their own local derivatives. In time, as these communist countries became hard up for cash, they turned to one of the few reliable and desirable export commodities they had: weapons. In short order, these countries started exporting arms just like the Russians were doing, and in almost no time at all, the AK-47 was and remains to this day the most common rifle in the hands of soldiers. While the AK-47 would continue to get upgrades later in life, such as an ammunition change that became the AK-74 or smaller changes that became the AKM family, the principle of operation remained the same. Even with these later designs, the original AK-47 makes up about 75 million of the current 100 million AK family-style rifles in the world today, cementing its continued use for years to come. One of the most venerable rifles in the world, the M16 has served American forces faithfully from the jungles of South America to the deserts of the Middle East. In service for nearly half a century, the M16 was at its inception a departure from traditional battle rifle thinking and a markedly different weapon than those being produced by America's adversaries. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're taking a look at the evolution of one of the most iconic rifles in history, the M16. Following World War II, the U.S. Army had a serious problem. Its infantry was being equipped with up to 4 different weapons, from the M1 Garand to the Thompson submachine gun, and all were proving ineffective in modern combat. What the Army desired was a single weapon that could do the job of the various different weapons infantry units may be equipped with, something that could be lethally accurate at long ranges such as the M2 carbine, while being able to deliver suppressing fire like the Browning automatic rifle. The Army decided that it would need a rifle chambered to fire the 7.62mm round, which would also be used by the new general-purpose machine gun under development. Various designs were submitted by well-known manufacturers, to include upgraded designs of the M1 Garand, but entering the competition late, Armalite was forced to hurriedly submit an AR-10 prototype rifle for testing. Unlike other rifles which featured walnut and steel, the AR-10 was a surprisingly lightweight design made of aluminum and plastic, weighing in at only 6.85 pounds while empty. Though Springfield Armory test staff commented that the AR-10 was the best automatic rifle they had ever tested, the Army ended up choosing what would become the M14 rifle, which was basically just an updated M1 Garand with a 20-round magazine and automatic fire capability. A few years later, the M14 would come face-to-face with the AK-47 in the jungles of Vietnam. Almost immediately, battlefield reports claimed that the M14 was completely uncontrollable when firing in full automatic mode, and that soldiers couldn't carry enough ammunition to maintain fire superiority over the AK. In fact, many soldiers had taken to ditching their M14s for AK-47s pulled off the corpses of slain enemy combatants, which led to friendly fire incidents when American troops fired on the sound of an AK-47 in their midst, believing it to be an enemy. The U.S. was outgunned daily in the dangerous jungles of Vietnam, and it was clear that a replacement rifle had to be found ASAP. The Army was thus forced to reconsider a 1957 request by General Willard G. Wyman, commander of the U.S. Continental Army Command, to develop a lighter .223 caliber 5.56mm rifle, which could fire in both semi and fully automatic modes, with most believing that the .223 caliber lacked the killing power of a .30 caliber round. The new rifle would have to prove that it could penetrate a U.S. helmet at 500 yards and retain a velocity in excess of the speed of sound, while still being able to match or exceed the wounding ability of a .30 caliber round. In response, Armalite scaled down their AR-10 prototype and delivered the AR-15. Firing the smaller .22 caliber round, the bullets would destabilize when entering the human body and fragment or tumble, thus vastly increasing their lethality over a .30 caliber round, which might zip straight through. The smaller caliber also meant that the rifle would be much more controllable in fully automatic firing mode due to the vastly reduced kick, and with rounds being a third of the weight of .30 caliber rounds, soldiers could carry more ammunition and sustain fire for longer. The AR-15 could also fire at rates of 600 to 700 rounds a minute, with an impressively low jamming rate, and the individual parts of the rifle were stamped out instead of being hand-machined, allowing them to be mass-produced and greatly reducing both their cost and increasing the speed of manufacturing. The lack of specialized equipment needed for its construction also meant that, unlike the AK-47, whose manufacture was limited to a few plants with the proper equipment, the M16 could be produced nearly anywhere, which would make interruption of supplies in case of war against a foe such as the Soviet Union nearly impossible. Despite the obvious superiority of the AR-15 over the M14, the Army was very reluctant to adopt the rifle. In fact, it was the Air Force who was the first to adopt the weapon, ordering 8,500 rifles and 8.5 million rounds of ammunition. The Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency then acquired 1,000 of the Air Force's AR-15s and shipped them to be tested by the South Vietnamese Army, with the Vietnamese soldiers quickly falling in love with the weapon. Over the course of testing by the South Vietnamese, the AR-15 recorded 0 broken parts while firing 80,000 rounds in one stage of testing, and in total, they needed only 2 replacement parts for the 1,000 weapons over the entire course of testing. The Vietnamese government would go on to request that the US provide the AR-15 as the standard rifle for its forces, but the request would be denied by Admiral Harry Felt, the Commander-in-Chief of Pacific Forces, on recommendation of the US Army. Historically a hard-headed service, the US Army continues to decline the AR-15 despite its growing and very obvious superiority. During 1962 and 1963, the US military continued to test the weapon with positive evaluations emphasizing its lightness, lethality, and reliability. The Army Materiel Command, however, criticized the weapon's inaccuracy and penetration power at very long ranges. However, in 1963, American Special Forces asked for the AR-15 to be made their standard weapon. CIA operatives and select Army airborne units were also being equipped exclusively with the AR-15. And eventually, Secretary of the Army Cyrus Vance ordered an investigation into why exactly the AR-15 was being rejected by the Army. The investigation revealed that the personnel in charge of testing the AR-15 up against the M14 had rigged the tests in favor of the M14. Within the Army Materiel Command, the bias remained, as it had historically been with larger caliber rifles capable of firing at longer ranges, believing that slow, deliberate fire and a round that could remain accurate at extreme ranges was of utmost importance. Yet in the jungles of Vietnam, where firefights took place at ranges of 30 to 50 yards, the ability to deliver automatic fire quickly was critical, and the M14 was poorly suited for the job. It would take an order directly from Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to halt production of the M14, and for U.S. Armed Forces to formally adopt the AR-15 as their main battle rifle. Yet the Army was allowed to ask for modifications for its AR-15s, which by now should have proven to be a mistake because you should never let the Army ask for anything. With delivery of the first shipments of AR-15s, Army staff asked that the design be changed to include a manual bolt closure so that a soldier could ram a round in if it failed to seat properly in the chamber. The Air Force immediately objected over this request, stating that during 3 years of testing and operation under all types of conditions, the Air Force had no record of malfunctions that could have been corrected by a manual bolt closing device. They further stated that the addition of a manual bolt closure feature would add weight and complexity to the weapon, reducing its reliability. The Marine Corps would come to the Air Force's defense, stating that there was absolutely no need for the added feature. In the end, Colonel Howard Yount, who managed Army procurement of the rifle, would defend his request by stating the M1, the M14, and the carbine had always had something for the soldier to push on, that maybe this would be a comforting feeling to him or something. Needless to say, Air Force and Marine Corps personnel would roll their eyes at the good colonel, though unfortunately the Army's insistence would go on to force a redesign of the weapon anyway, resulting in the M16. The first version of the M16, however, would fare poorly in wet conditions, such as those of the Vietnam jungles. It experienced a malfunction rate of 2 per 1,000 rounds fired, and soldiers began writing letters home about the terrible quality of their new rifles. Eventually, enough letters from soldiers overseas were forwarded by concerned parents to a congressman that a congressional investigation was launched. That investigation would discover that the M16 had been billed as self-cleaning, despite the fact that no rifle is or ever has been. Thus, troops were issued the rifle without cleaning kits or instructions on how to properly clean the weapon. Because the M16 works by redirecting part of the high-pressure gases caused by firing back toward the bolt and thus chambering and seating a new round, the rifle was especially vulnerable to misfiring or jamming if not cleaned regularly. The investigation also found that the M16 and .556 round it had fired had been approved for use with DuPont IMR 8208M extruded gunpowder, but in production the powder had been switched to WC-846 ball powder, which produced much more fouling and thus jammed the M16 much more frequently. The lack of a forward assist also made it impossible for a soldier to successfully seat around when the rifle jammed. And lastly, the firing chamber was not chrome-plated, which created corrosion problems. By 1968, though, these issues had been addressed and corrected in the form of the M16A1, and a report by the Department of the Army found that the new and improved rifle had found widespread acceptance by U.S. troops. By the end of the war in Vietnam, a Blue Ribbon Defense Panel concluded that the M16 had saved the lives of 20,000 U.S. servicemen during the war, who would have died had the M14 remained in service. The M16 would go on to continue serving U.S. Armed Forces all the way up to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where it served alongside its slightly smaller and more maneuverable cousin, the M4. Combat troops would go on to continue praising the reliability of the M16, with one unit in the Helmand province of Afghanistan reported that despite being covered in fine powdered sand, being dusty, wet, and covered in mud, the weapons would not jam even during intense, hours-long firefights. Only a single soldier reported his weapon jamming, and only after his M16 was covered in mud after climbing out of a canal. After clearing the weapon, the rifle continued firing and remained operational for the rest of the engagement, still receiving high marks for reliability, accuracy, lethality, and range. The M16 is slowly being phased out across the U.S. military in favor of the M4, yet still remains one of the best battle rifles ever created. The M16 and the AK-47, two of the world's most iconic firearms. One is the most prolific rifle in history and a symbol of revolution around the world. The other represents American precision and lethality. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, both weapons came face-to-face on battlefields from Asia to the Middle East. But which is the superior weapon? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're taking a look at the M16 versus the AK-47. During World War II, German research showed that most firefights occur within 400 meters, yet the rifle used by armies around the world were all engineered for conflicts far outside of this range, and ultimately overpowered for the reality of war. The only other option at the time was the submachine gun, whose high rate of fire was devastating in close quarters, but its low range and accuracy made it impossible to use at ranges past 50 meters. The Germans realized they needed a new weapon, and thus the assault rifle was born. The Germans would go on to marry the high rate of fire of the submachine gun with the long-range accuracy of a standard rifle and create the Sturmgewehr 44. With a lower rate of fire than a traditional submachine gun, but far greater range and accuracy, the Sturmgewehr gave German soldiers an unparalleled advantage on the battlefields of World War II. Having learned from very painful lessons inflicted on them by the Germans, the Soviets would go on to immediately recognize the need for an assault rifle of their own. After the war, opting for a 7.62mm cartridge, Soviet gunsmiths developed the vaunted AK-47, which entered production in the early 1950s. The weapon featured both semi-automatic and fully automatic firing modes, letting Soviet soldiers deliver accurate long-range fire or overwhelming suppressing fire when needed. Built upon the Soviet ideology of massing large numbers of cheaply made weapons, AK-47s were cheap to mass produce, but because of its stamped steel design, it's not easy to manufacture without specialized equipment, a potential vulnerability in the case of war against the US, as the Soviets would have faced the threat of having the bulk of their specialized manufacturing infrastructure targeted and potentially destroyed. The AK-47 was also much more difficult to repair on the battlefield, featuring parts that were riveted together and would require special tools to grind off an old rivet and set a new one. It also featured many smaller, less durable springs and other parts that required replacing after every few thousand rounds. And after disassembly, beyond the field stripping stage, parts take time to regain their fit, leaving them vulnerable to shaking loose and falling out when firing the weapon. All these deficiencies, however, were offset by the relatively cheap price, costing just a fraction of the M16, and thus letting them be mass-produced. Working off a battlefield cannibalization ideology, troops were not expected to receive resupply on the battlefield, and were instead taught to simply cannibalize other AK-47s to repair their own. This was largely in line with most of Soviet military doctrine, whose poor focus on logistics continues to plague even the modern Russian army today. Its cheap cost and ease of manufacturing has led the AK-47 to become the most prolific weapon ever made, and out of an estimated 500 million firearms around the world, 75 million are AK-47s. By comparison to their Soviet counterparts, American military planners were much slower to adopt the idea of an assault rifle for infantry. Having failed to learn the lessons of World War II, American GIs would go on to fight in the jungles of Vietnam and Korea, where the AK-47 would be used to devastating effect against inferior-equipped American infantry. Equipped with the M16, a rifle with a 20-round magazine and fully automatic fire capacity, American soldiers found that they could not compete with the superior AK-47. Completely uncontrollable at full auto fire, and without the ability to carry enough ammunition to maintain fire superiority over the AK-47, the M14 was a significantly inferior weapon and costing American lives. The U.S. Army quickly drew up requirements for a new battlefield rifle and reconsidered a 1957 request by General Willard G. Wyman to develop a 5.56mm select fire rifle weighing no more than 6 pounds when loaded with a 20-round magazine. The rifle had to be able to pierce a standard U.S. helmet at a range of 500 yards and retain a velocity in excess of the speed of sound. This request resulted in the development of the Armalite AR-15 rifle, which, while overwhelmingly superior to the M14, the Army still opposed its adoption. It wouldn't be until 1963 that Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara personally ordered a halt to M14 production, that the AR-15, redesigned and redesignated as the M16, that the U.S. would finally have a battle rifle to match that of its foes. Made of steel, aluminum, and composite plastics, the M16 was significantly lighter than the AK-47, with a fully loaded M16 weighing in at 7.9 pounds versus an AK-47 at over 10.5 pounds. The M16 could also be manufactured from a variety of alternate materials, however, and could even be fitted with wooden furniture, much like the AK in an emergency. It required very little specialized equipment, which allowed small-scale manufacturers to easily produce large numbers. This would have proven to be critical in a major war against the Soviet Union, as it would have almost been impossible to disrupt the production of M16s during the war. The M16 was also very easy to disassemble and reassemble on the battlefield, allowing soldiers to carry out quick battlefield repairs that were impossible with the AK-47. Its sights were also easily adjusted by individual soldiers with just the tip of a rifle bullet, while the AK's front sight required adjustment by armory personnel. Ultimately, the M16 may have been a more expensive weapon to produce, but its battlefield durability and ease of repair gave it many critical advantages over the AK-47. But what do the numbers tell us? How does the AK-47 stack up to the M16 on the range, and which is the better weapon? With its larger caliber, the AK-47 7.62mm round enjoys greater penetration power at close to medium ranges than the M16's 5.56mm round. At 10 meters, an AK can penetrate 29 inches through ballistic gelatin with no fragmentation of its bullet. The M16, on the other hand, can only penetrate 14 inches and its bullet will almost certainly fragment. Against sandbags at 100 meters, an AK can penetrate 13 inches without fragmentation, while an M16 round can only penetrate 4 inches with complete disintegration. However, with its far lower muzzle velocity of only 2,350 feet a second versus the M16's 3,150 feet a second, the M16 enjoys far greater penetration power at longer ranges than the AK-47, able to penetrate both sides of a steel helmet at 300 meters and one side up to 500 meters away, and the AK only able to penetrate both sides of a steel helmet at 200 meters and one side at 400 meters. A higher muzzle velocity means greater range, something the M16 trumps the AK-47 in, with a maximum effective range of 460 meters versus 350 meters. Designed to be good enough to hit an adult male in the torso at a range of 300 meters, accuracy is not the AK-47's strong suit, and expert operators still have difficulty placing 10 consecutive rounds on target at these ranges. The M16, on the other hand, has been called one of the most accurate rifles ever created, and with its light recoil, high velocity, and flat bullet trajectory, U.S. soldiers in Fallujah during the Second Iraq War were routinely landing so many headshots on insurgent forces with such incredible accuracy that it wasn't until wounds were closely examined that observers realized the enemy fighters had not been executed. At 100 meters, an M16 can place a 10-shot group with an accuracy of 4.3-inch dispersion, while an AK-47 manages a far greater dispersion of 5.9 inches. Accuracy further falls for the AK at greater ranges, with an AK-47 managing a dispersion rate of 17.5 inches for a 10-shot group at 300 meters, versus the M16's 12.6 inches at the same distance. Hit probabilities for an AK-47 are also far lower than an M16, with an AK having a hit probability of 94% at 300 meters versus the M16's 100%, 82% at 400 meters versus 96%, and 67% at 500 meters versus 87%. Both weapons feature a selective firing lever, which allows the weapon to be used in various firing modes. However, the AK-47's firing lever is large and difficult to manipulate, requiring a right-handed shooter to take his hands off the pistol grip and thus remove his finger from the trigger in order to remove the safety. The M16, on the other hand, features an easy-to-manipulate flip lever that is easily operated by the shooter's thumb, which means the M16 user never has to remove his finger from the trigger or re-establish a sight picture the way an AK-47 shooter would. This allows the M16 operator to engage targets faster, with much more accurate fire than the AK shooter. At full auto, the AK-47 can deliver 600 rounds per minute, versus the M16's 700 to 950 rounds per minute. At practical firing rates, though, which won't result in almost immediate barrel overheating and warping, an AK manages a rate of fire of 100 rounds per minute, versus the M16's 150 rounds per minute. Later variants of the M16, however, would do away with its ability to be fired at full auto, the US military believing it to be an impractical and largely inaccurate waste of ammunition, and instead opt for 3-round burst firing rate, which greatly increased lethality in close quarters combat. The AK-47 has no such feature, but with its larger round, has always enjoyed far greater capacity for carnage at close quarters anyway. So which is the better weapon? Ultimately, it depends on your overall philosophy. Do you prefer greater stopping and penetration power at short ranges, or far greater accuracy and the ability to engage targets at extreme ranges? The AK-47 was cheap and easy to mass produce, even if the need for special steel stamping equipment put Soviet manufacturing in dire risk during war. Yet it still suited the needs of the Soviet Army perfectly, and has become the most iconic and prolific firearm of all time. Yet the M16 featured the superior machining and emphasis on accuracy and versatility that is so iconic of the US military, making it a symbol of US technological sophistication. For us, though, declaring a clear winner is difficult. For a close-quarters combat expert, the AK-47's larger round and increased lethality in close range helps ensure a first-hit incapacitation that is so critical in CQB scenarios, while the M16's burst fire mode helps bridge the gap between the two weapons. The AK's far greater armor penetration at these ranges gives it an indisputable advantage. Yet, it's the M16's far greater accuracy and effective ranges that makes it so appealing for the average soldier, who must be ready to meet threats both at close, intermediate, and long ranges in the modern urban environment. The AK's deficiencies in these areas, along with the difficulty of battlefield repairs, inevitably forces us to declare the M16 a slightly superior firearm over the AK-47. History has repeated itself again. Food shortages, scarce oil reserves, political infighting. Nobody knows for sure why, but the world finds itself on the precipice of another world war. As all the armies of the world come together to fight across every forest, field, sand dune, swamp, and mountain on Earth, the one question on everyone's mind is what tools will enable them to win. Despite all the advances of modern weaponry, at the end of the day, this war will be fought and won by the common infantrymen. But in this epic contest of everyone versus everyone, which infantry rifle would give a country the competitive edge needed on today's most technologically advanced battlefields? Number 10. The Galil. Starting off this list is one of the most popular yet unheard of assault rifles in the world. The Galil was Israel's response to the prolific use of the AK-47 by Arab nations they were at war with. They wanted a rifle that could operate in the sand and dust of the Middle East, but was still fine-tuned and accurate. Their solution was to build the Galil of the Finnish Valmet, which was a direct clone of the AK-47. The end result was a rugged rifle that was chambered in both the .556 NATO round and could fire the heavier 7.62 by 51mm NATO machine gun cartridge. The larger caliber Galil was meant to be a squad automatic weapon, while the lighter Galil was for the average infantryman. Both of these rifles served well, but they only saw limited action due to the Israeli Defense Forces acquiring large numbers of M16s from the US. The Galil also suffered from accuracy issues since its effective range was only about 400 meters. But despite the limited use by Israel, the Galil was exported in great numbers and is currently in service with dozens of countries, making it one of the most prolific combat-tested rifles in the world today. Number 9. The FAMAS. Another obscure but combat-proven rifle you may have never heard of is the FAMAS. The FAMAS was first made for the French military in 1978 as a way to replace its aging semi-automatic rifle still in use since the end of World War II. It was an innovative design for the time, becoming one of the first mass-produced bullpup-style rifles, meaning the magazine was placed behind the trigger. This was done as a way to increase maneuverability and produce a more balanced feel, which improved accuracy. The FAMAS takes the standard 5.56 NATO cartridge and has select fire modes of semi-automatic, 3-round burst fire, and fully automatic. It can also be equipped with a grenade launcher and comes fitted with a bipod on the barrel to provide for incredibly long-distance shots. The barrel is also unique in that it only has 3 grooves compared to most rifles, which usually have between 4 to 6. This is important since the grooves are what make the bullet spin after leaving the barrel, making it a real possibility that the FAMAS would not have as tight of groupings as other rifles at longer distances. Another downside are its magazines. The FAMAS only works with proprietary 25-round magazines and will not fire properly with standard 5.56 NATO magazines used by many countries around the world. So if you're using this and you need a spare magazine from an ally, you might be out of luck. Number 8. The FN SCAR. The Fabrique Nationale SOF Combat Assault Rifle, or SCAR, was first designed in 2003 as a way to produce a deadly accurate, reliable, and long-range assault rifle for use by American Special Forces. What emerged was truly a feat of modern engineering. The SCAR comes in 2 versions, SCAR Light and SCAR Heavy. The light version shoots the standard 5.56 NATO round, while the heavy version shoots the larger 7.62 round. It can lay down deadly accurate fire in either single shots or fully automatic modes of firing. What makes the SCAR really impressive is its reliability and versatility. In a test conducted by the US Army in 2007, the SCAR outperformed the M4 carbine by a wide margin and beat out most of its competition in regard to the fewest number of misfires. The SCAR is also an ambidextrous weapon, meaning it can be easily modified for left or right-handed shooters to use it with ease. The only downside to the SCAR is its cost. Coming in at over $3,000 per rifle, it's the most expensive one on this list and is not an affordable option for equipping larger armies. Number 7. The H&K G36. A more affordable option compared to the SCAR as a lightweight, accurate, but reliable replacement is the G36. In the 1990s, the German army was looking for a modern replacement for its reliable but outdated G3 battle rifles. Their solution was to build an entirely new design to make it more compatible with other NATO countries. The rifle was designed with a standard gas blowback system, where the expelled gases from fired cartridges pushed the bolt back. This was a drastic departure from previous designs of H&K, which used a series of rollers to push the bolt back. Such a new design made their rifle lighter and more accurate, since there was not as much recoil using the smaller 5.56 round. The smaller round also enabled troops to carry more ammunition so they could sustain greater, more accurate volumes of fully automatic fire than before. The rifle also came standard with a 1.5x zoom scope and red dot sight permanently attached to the plastic carrying handle above the receiver. But these new sights have not come without controversy. Troops in the field have frequently complained that when the rifle gets extremely hot, its accuracy diminishes by a good amount. This is due to a combination of the sights becoming easily dirty in foul conditions like sand, and the plastic handguard up forward becoming unbearably hot to the touch. Number 6. The SIG SG-550. The brainchild of the Swiss Army, who were looking to combine the ruggedness of the AK-47 with the precision accuracy of the American M16. The result of that was the 3-foot-long, 9-pound SIG SG-550. What makes this rifle stand out is that it actually delivers as promised. During its trial phase, the rifle went through some of the most punishing tests, including having water poured down the barrel, sand pushed into the receiver, submerging it in mud, and shooting tens of thousands of rounds without stopping. Nothing the Swiss Army could throw at it could seem to make this rifle skip a beat. What makes it even more versatile is the fact that it has a folding stock, giving the average soldier more maneuverability in close quarters combat, and can be attached with a bipod, allowing for accurate, sustained fire at long distances. It is also fully automatic and has a 3-round burst capability. Its main drawback might be its ammunition and magazines. The SIG SG-550 shoots the same 5.56 NATO round as the M4, which might seem pretty underpowered for such a heavy piece of equipment. The magazines also hold 20 rounds and during testing were the only part of the rifle to fail consistently, which might mean trouble for users if they're constantly having to change magazines, or worse, find one that works. Number 5. The Type 95. An equally innovative rifle, the Type 95 emerged in the 90s as China's solution to, like the Swiss with the SG-550, adopt a modern rifle capable of beating both the AK-74 and M16. One of the main ways they did this was creating a brand new kind of ammunition, 5.8 by 42 mm. This special kind of ammunition has been shrouded in mystery since the Chinese government claims it has superior velocity and accuracy compared to the 5.56 and 5.45 rounds. No outside entities have been allowed to do transparent testing to confirm these claims. What is certain is that the Type 95 is a simple rifle requiring little training to become proficient at using. One of its simplest features is its striker firing mechanism. Most rifles and pistols use a hammer method where the hammer strikes the firing pin, which ignites the primer and fires the bullet. With a striker method, the hammer and firing pin act as one unit. This greatly reduces the amount of parts needed, making it easier to take apart and clean in the field or repair in the armory. The Type 95 is also a well-balanced rifle, taking into account a low center of gravity, which would give the shooter a smaller profile in combat. But that, of course, is still in theory, since the Type 95 has never actually seen combat yet, so its performance against other rifles has yet to truly be determined. Number 4. The L85A2. Beginning in the 1980s, the British wanted to replace their aging rifles with something more modern that provided sustained, accurate fire in a lightweight and ergonomic package. After years of testing, their end result was the L85A1. But this initial model, with its stamped receiver and 3-position gas regulator for adverse conditions, had too many design flaws, mostly with its faulty magazines. The British government came close to scrapping the whole project entirely, but instead they opted to fix them, which resulted in the L85A2, which has become the standard British Army rifle. The L85A2 kept much of the A1 model's technology except for its magazines, which were replaced with the more reliable standard NATO 5.56 ones. The L85A2 was also capable of both fully automatic and semi-automatic fire. It was the same bullpup design as the FAMAS, giving users a balanced feel, combined with the standard 4x zoom SUSAT sight, giving shooters great long-range capabilities. While reports from the battlefield are still mixed, it appears that most of the reliability issues have been fixed, and this combat-proven rifle with more than 3 decades of service will continue to be a menace on any battlefield it's used. Number 3. The H&K G3 Battle Rifle. The G3 is undoubtedly the oldest rifle on this list, coming into existence in West Germany in 1961. Though the rifle that it was based off, the Setme rifle made in Spain, had its origins at the end of World War II. The G3 is chambered in the powerful 7.62 by 51 mm round, or the 308 for those that still use the customary system of measurement. The G3 quickly became a popular rifle mostly due to its simplicity. It has very few moving parts and its receiver is stamped. The receiver assembly is like the brain of a rifle in that it's what loads, fires, and ejects spent shell casings. This differs from a milled receiver, which is made entirely from a solid block of steel. Though some say this affects accuracy, there really is no scientific truth to that claim. But what does affect its accuracy is the weight, coming in at 11 pounds unloaded, making it the heaviest rifle on this list, and not for the faint of heart. Despite its weight, that did not stop almost 50 countries from adopting it into service. It has also seen action in conflicts all over the world, from Africa to Asia and the Middle East, and everywhere in between. The G3 is still in use with dozens of countries in numerous conflicts today, proving it's a capable, reliable, and effective weapon of war, despite its immense size and age. Number 2. The AK-74. The AK-74 is the modern-day combat-tested replacement to the classic AK-47. The AK-74 was released in 1974 and was quickly adopted as the main battle rifle of the Soviet Union. The Soviets wanted to produce a rifle that was equivalent to the M16 but could improve on some of the M16's weaknesses, like stopping power and reliability. Kalashnikov did this by creating the 5.45 by 39 mm round. The 5.45 by 39 mm round was revolutionary for its time. This was a lightweight yet powerful round that tumbled or spinned when flying through the air, which could cause more damage when it hit its target. That is, if you could hit the target. For all the improvements it made over the M16, the AK-74 was still as wildly inaccurate as its predecessor. Though a trained shooter up to about 400 yards can still obtain consistent, tight groupings of shots. After that, the accuracy drops significantly. For every 100 yards past that, it decreases by about 10%, until at 800 yards, your chance of hitting a target is a mere 31%. Not very good considering most firefights today take place at such extreme ranges. Number 1. The M4 Carbine. The M4 Carbine is the standard issue rifle for U.S. forces. It was designed to replace the heavier and fully automatic M16 rifle that the United States had been using since the Vietnam War, with a lighter, more compact, and semi-automatic model. The M4 Carbine is incredibly light, weighing in at just a little over 6 pounds fully loaded. It takes a 30-round magazine and can lay down deadly accurate fire at over 600 yards. But that firing might prove deadly for its user, too. Despite all of its advances in technology, some studies have shown that in abnormal conditions of firing thousands of rounds, the M4 will suffer more misfires and jams than other rifles. There have also been complaints that the 5.56 NATO round it fires does not have enough stopping power for the more determined fighters, with some reports coming from the battlefield of people being shot multiple times and still fighting on. But as a general rule, if you are Joe Private plinking away with timed accurate fire, the rifle will perform well and stop most enemies coming your way. So there you have it, the world's top 10 infantry rifles. Each one is a formidable foe in its own right, but has its own weaknesses as well. Overall, if the world were at war, every country should be worried about what kind of firepower the other side brings, since everyone has spent decades trying to improve on the drawbacks and shortcomings of other countries' designs. The M14 rifle was a weapon designed in response to the massive firepower that could be wrought upon by the Soviets' AK-47. It also satisfied a desire by high-level U.S. commanders who wanted to replace the aging World War II-era weapons still in service by U.S. troops in the mid-1950s. The M14, though designed to be the standard infantry rifle for generations to come, was soon overshadowed by developments in the M16 rifle. Despite this, it still saw extensive combat use throughout the Vietnam War. But as U.S. troops would quickly find out, its unwieldy size and heavy outdated design would make it difficult to operate in the humid, dense jungles of Vietnam. However, even after its eventual replacement by the M16, the M14 was not forgotten. The rifle was still a favorite among some of the Vietnam War's top snipers, such as Carlos Hathcock and Chuck Mawhinney. In addition to being used by the Navy and Coast Guard Riverine squadrons, Air Force security forces, and a reserve rifle with the Marines and Army whenever shortages of M16 rifles were felt. Additionally, variants of the rifle made a comeback in the 1990s because of their relatively long range and impressive stopping power. So, what was the secret behind the M14's long-lasting success, even though it had a relatively short career as the standard issue weapon of the United States military? Let's find out. The M14 was first conceived of in 1958. At the time, the government owned the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, where production of the rifle began. The original plan was for the M14 to take the place of several different firearms that were being utilized by the United States military. When the M14 was first proposed, the United States was using the M1 Garand, the 1903 Springfield, the M1 Carbine, the M3 submachine gun, the M1928 Thompson, and the M1918 Browning automatic rifle, also known as the BAR. The thought was that all these guns could be replaced by one versatile rifle that could switch between semi-automatic and automatic firing modes. By doing this, the United States could mass-produce the weapon and ramp up production in a way that was fast and cost-effective. Unfortunately, the manufacturing of the M14 was slow and tedious. In the end, there were many complaints from the soldiers who used it. The M14 used a gas-operated firing system that was based off the M1 and housed a cleaning kit in the butt of the gun just like its predecessor. The M14 was also designed so that an M2 bayonet or an M76 rifle grenade launcher attachment could be mounted on it. The M14 could also be equipped with the M2 bipod, which was an important key feature necessary to improve the accuracy of the gun. The M14 was able to switch between semi-automatic and automatic firing modes. This meant that the rifle was versatile and could be used in many different combat situations as long as it could be controlled. This was one of the reasons for making sure the rifle could be mounted with the M2 bipod. The M14 used the 7 7 6.2mm rounds that could also be armor-piercing or tracers. The magazine of the rifle could hold 20 rounds, and the gun fired around 750 rounds per minute on full auto. The rifle's muzzle velocity was 850 meters per second and had an effective range of 460 meters. This made the M14 one of the most accurate military rifles of the time at a distance, which is one of the reasons there was a resurgence of M14 variations in the 80s and 90s. The gun itself weighed around 10.7 pounds when loaded, and for soldiers who opted for the bipod, an extra 2 pounds was added. When it came off the production line, the M14 was state-of-the-art. It was designed to be able to fight in city warfare in Europe and the wild terrain of Russia. Unfortunately for the M14, but luckily for all of humanity, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union never escalated into a direct conflict between the two nations. Instead of finding themselves in cities and deciduous forests, the US soldiers were deployed to the dense jungles of Vietnam, where long-distance and city fighting was rare. After 15 years of development and production, the M14 made its debut. It was the standard issue rifle when Marines and soldiers made their combat debut in Vietnam in 1965 and would dominate the battlefield for the next several years. However, because Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara opted to make the M16 the standard infantry rifle of the United States, it began to be gradually phased out of frontline service, beginning with field test trials in 1967. By 1969, most M14 rifles had been replaced, and after 1970, they were rarely issued, save for the exceptions noted earlier. Due to delays and problems in production, the rollout of the M14 was slow. The first and only unit in the United States Army to be completely equipped with the M14 was the 101st Airborne Division in 1960. The Fleet Marine Force eventually switched from their standard issue M1s to the M14s the following year. There were other problems with the M14 that eventually led to the halt of the gun's production in the 60s. Many of the issues with the earlier M14s had to do with quality control. The guns were being manufactured to be cost-effective at the expense of reliable parts. This led to components frequently jamming or breaking in the gun. The United States fixed several of the problems by giving the gun more resilient receivers and having stricter quality controls on bolts and hardware used to construct the rifles. The other problems did not have such an easy fix. The accuracy of the M14 was not great during automatic firing. The recoil was immense, causing the muzzle to move all over the place. The bipod helped, but even when set up properly, the M14 was extremely difficult to control when firing in an automatic mode. In fact, the recoil was so bad when firing an automatic that troops in the field had their own armorers make changes to the receiver to get the rifle to fire slower to make automatic fire more accurate and sustained. Later testing back in the United States showed that these modifications, though not as designed but necessary for combat operations, proved that they could slow the firing rate by about a third of what it had been designed for. There were also modified M14s developed during the war to serve as a squad's main automatic weapon for heavy firing. One example of this was the M14A1, but its firepower proved disappointing, and the military moved away from these designs for more reliable and powerful weapons. The M14 only served as the primary weapon for United States infantry for 7 years before it was replaced by assault rifles such as the M16. The M14 would have been perfect for a war fought in European cities or in Russia, but its large ammunition and uncontrollable automatic firing option was not optimal for the war in the Vietnam jungle. The M14 was just too long and unwieldy in the dense vegetation. Its weight also severely slowed soldiers down. The gun ran into more problems with the humidity of the jungle than anything else. The wood stock of the M14 expanded in the wet, humid jungle, causing the weapon to lose its accuracy and control when in fully automatic mode. Aiming the M14 in these conditions became next to impossible. Fiberglass stocks were eventually created for the M14, but at that point in the war, it was too late since the gun was already being phased out of the United States' arsenal. Even though the M14 was almost completely replaced by the M16 during the Vietnam War, the United States military was still fond of the rifle and decided to keep a limited number in its inventory after the end of the war for future use in long-range marksmanship rifles. The basic M14 was modified to meet the needs of soldiers in combat situations outside of the jungle. Most of the variants were not utilized, but the evolution of the M14 over the years led to certain weapons that are still being used in combat today. Modification of the M14 began with the creation of the M15. This rifle never made it out of initial production, but it led to weapons that would eventually be used in combat. The initial differences between the two guns was that the M15s were equipped with a heavier barrel and a stock than the M14s. However, the military found that the M15 did not work any better than the original rifle and was therefore scrapped. The initial tests of the M15 did lead to a redesign of the M14, which included an improved selector switch, hinged butt plate, and a bipod to create a better version of the rifle. The next variation of the original M14 was the M14E2, This version of the gun was given a full pistol-gripped inline stock, and this was done to reduce recoil and make firing the weapon in automatic mode more manageable. It helped, but only slightly. The M14E2 also had a muzzle compensator and folding grip under the front stock. All these additions made the firing of the M14 on full automatic better, but it was still hard to control and overheated quickly. Plus, the limited magazine size of 20 rounds did not make it an efficient choice for a fully automatic support gun. As it became more and more clear that the M14 would not be the weapon of choice for the United States infantry soldiers, the military found ways to modify the gun for other purposes. An example of this was the M14 SMUD, which stands for Standoff Munition Disruption. The M14 model was used by soldiers specializing in the disposal of explosive ordnance. They would use the M14 SMUD to safely destroy unexploded mines and bombs from a distance. Basically, this gun was the standard issue M14, but with a scope on it. After the scope was mounted on the M14, more and more variations of the weapon started to be designed. The original concept for the gun was solid, and its larger bullets and longer range made it more versatile for combat situations outside of the Vietnamese jungle. Eventually, as technology got better, the design of the M14 was improved upon, and the components that made up the rifle were swapped for better state-of-the-art parts. This led to designs such as the Mark 14 Enhanced Battle Rifle. The Mark 14 was designed specifically for tactical missions. The rifle included an 18-inch barrel and retractable stock. This version of the M14 also had more rails for accessories to allow soldiers to customize their weapon. The M14 Tactical built on the upgraded Mark 14 EBM design. It used the same stock as its predecessor, but was equipped with a 22-inch barrel and a Smith Enterprise muzzle brake. The rifle was adopted by the U.S. Coast Guard, who found its range and firepower optimal for their operations. The M14 was continually modified, and parts of the gun were upgraded or incorporated into other weapons, most often sniper rifles. The M14 was an excellent starting point for the United States military to build off of. Powerful rifles such as the M39 Enhanced Marksman Rifle and the M89 SR Model 89 Sniper Rifle was designed through heavy modifying of the M14 in the 1980s. The AWC G2A, M21, and M25 sniper rifles were constructed in the 90s and 2000s using the M14 design as a base and modifying it into several different variants. Today, the M14 is still in use by the United States military. In fact, it can be found in all four main branches. It's mostly used for training and non-combat situations, but the M14 successors are sometimes used as sniper rifles in the field. The M14 is commonly seen in ceremonies conducted by the honor guards, color guards, and drill teams. Even though the rifle was retired as the standard issue weapon for the armed forces before it saw much combat, the M14 still had a solid design, which the military used for several decades. In 2019, China held the 70th annual National Day Parade. In addition to being a celebration of Chinese culture, this parade has evolved into a showcase of the country's growing military might, and among the highlights of the 2019 iteration was a brand new rifle, which China is hailing as the next-generation rifle family for its military, the QBZ-191. Reports suggested that the rifle would be a standout, not only in China but on the global stage. Improved accuracy, greater reliability, and enhanced system performance were all touted, giving the impression that the QBZ-191 would be a rifle that could not only match what the country's enemies have, but exceed any other rifle's capabilities. But is any of this really true? As is so common with Chinese weapons, official information is thin on the ground, and what China does release could be classed as propaganda as much as real insight into the QBZ-191's capabilities. All we have are snatched video clips and outsider commentary. Both of these suggest that the QBZ-191 is a disaster of a rifle that won't help China make any sort of inroads in terms of matching or exceeding the rifles already available to other countries. Before we dig into that, it's worth taking a closer look at the state of Chinese rifles before the QBZ-191 came along. The QBZ-191 is designed to replace the QBZ-95 rifle that the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, has been using since around 1997. That rifle was important to China, not only for its quality but also because its introduction represented one of the first attempts the country made at standardizing rifles across its entire military. Prior to the QBZ-95, China essentially used whatever it could get its hands on, at least to a certain extent. This approach was most prevalent during World War II, as explained by Duo Yongxian in a 2022 article published by the China Project. Speaking of China before its liberation, he noted that soldiers in the country had no standardized weaponry. In the Northeast, they used Japanese rifles. In Shanghai, they used American guns. Down in Yunnan, they had French guns. In the Northwest, it was Russian equipment. It was a haphazard system of equipping a ragtag army, and one that couldn't persist as China marched toward militarization. Some relief from that system came after World War II, when China began working more directly with the Soviet Union, allowing for a consistent flow of AK-47s into the country. Duo, who was then in his 20s, worked under a Soviet advisor during this period. His aim was to help China's small arms industry at the time learn how to make as many SKS and AK-47 rifles as they possibly could. But the relationship between the Soviets and the Chinese producers didn't last. According to Duo, that left China in a position where it was essentially making a second-rate copy of a more established weapon. Its Type 56 assault rifle, also known as the Type 56 automatic, was essentially an AK-47, with the later Type 63 and Type 66 rifles also being derivative of Soviet designs. The problem persisted into the 1970s, with the PLA's entry into Vietnam in February 1979 showing that China was still equipping its army with variations of the AK-47 and SKS. China quickly retreated a month later, with one of its key problems being that it was essentially fighting fire with fire. Vietnam was also using Chinese and Soviet weapons, so China had no rifle-based advantage. A new rifle was needed. Developing one initially fell to a man named Wang Shijing, who started working on what would become the Type 81 rifle in mid-1979. His rifle entered the prototype stage in 1984, and it moved to full production in 1986, but it was rife with problems. Wang Shijing cut corners whenever he could, leading to his Type 81 essentially being a tweaked version of China's Type 66, again a rifle that was little more than a Soviet ripoff all knocked together with spare parts. Enter Duo Gangxian. Given a degree of freedom he'd never had before, Duo was tasked with creating a new rifle that would be more than a copy of Soviet technology. It should be China's rifle, the gun the nation could be proud to call its own, from production to the military. That remit led Duo to inviting two titans of the rifle manufacturing industry, Eugene Stoner and Mikhail Kalashnikov, to China in the early 1990s, inventors of the AR-15, which would be used by the US military as the M16, and the AK-47 respectively. Both provided insight that Duo couldn't get anywhere else. However, it was Stoner's input that was taken most seriously. Duo believed the M16 fired straighter and was more versatile than the AK-47. Armed with new knowledge, Duo set to work on a new Chinese rifle. The result was the QBZ-95. Going into production in 1995, the rifle would quickly become standard issue for all Chinese troops. It's not difficult to see why. An assault rifle, it has an effective range of about 1,640 feet when used on area targets, which drops to about 984 feet when fired at point targets. It fires Chinese-made 5.8 by 42mm rounds, which were specifically designed for the rifle, and has a standard 30-round magazine, as well as some variants being compatible with 75-round drum magazines. It can also pump out around 650 rounds per minute. But most importantly of all, it was Chinese. This history of China's military rifles offers important context when discussing the QBZ-191. Not only does it show that the new rifle is of completely Chinese origin as well, meaning it can't be accused of being a rip-off of another country's technology, it also showcases how new China is to developing rifles for its military. Everything it's made up to the introduction of the QBZ-95 was essentially a Soviet rifle, in all but name, with the QBZ-95 being the first rifle that China could truly call its own. While that advancement was important to China's development as a modern military power, it also means the country's designers and manufacturers only have around 30 years of experience working on rifles that aren't derived from others. That inexperience may be one of several issues that wind up making the QBZ-191 a far less effective rifle than China claims it to be. And that brings us to the first reports of the QBZ-191 being used. In April 2020, the National Interest reported on a video released by China Central Television showcasing PLA troops practicing with the QBZ-191. The video represented the first whiff anybody had outside of China of the weapon after its 2019 introduction, but it offered some insight into what the rifle would be offering to the PLA once it officially replaced the QBZ-95. After all, the QBZ-95 wasn't without its problems. Its flaws included hitches when trying to change firing modes, and cheaply made night sights that rapidly lost their glow. Throw in poor quality control, and it was possible that a QBZ-95 one soldier had would be more prone to issues like jamming than the version given to another soldier. The QBZ-191 is supposed to remedy those issues. National Interest reports that the carbine version of the rifle has a 10.5-inch barrel, though the version that will be given to infantry increases that to 14.5 inches. There's also a marksman variation of the rifle, which likely will have an even longer barrel. It's also clear to see inspiration being drawn from modern iterations of the AR-15 rifle, in addition to a Picatinny rail on top of the QBZ-191 that is clearly inspired by today's European rifles. Like the QBZ-95, it's a gas-operated assault rifle chambered with China's own 5.8 by 42mm rounds, though it at least has a new version of that round that's designed to work better over longer distances. Speaking of range, National Interest suggests it has a 1,312-foot range, dropping to 984 feet in the carbine version. That would make it less effective over longer distances than the QBZ-95, though the range figures released for that rifle may be exaggerated. These reports are backed by Military Factory, which offers the same effective range. As for firing, both resources suggest the QBZ-191 can rattle off around 750 rounds per minute, 100 more than the QBZ-95, and that soldiers can switch between semi-auto and full-auto modes at will. However, there's no burst fire mode. What's notable here is that the QBZ-191 represents a move toward a more traditional rifle layout. With the QBZ-95, China followed a bullpup layout, meaning the rifle's magazine and action mechanism sat behind the trigger. The rifle's receiver served as its buttstock, essentially making the rifle a stockless gun. The QBZ-191 does away with the bullpup design, likely for the better. After all, National Interest points out that this design made the QBZ-95 ergonomically awkward because it forces a soldier to place their face closer than they might like to the action when aiming. All of this points to the QBZ-191 being a definitive improvement over the QBZ-95. But if that's the case, why might the rifle end up becoming a complete disaster? That's certainly the impression you get if you browse the web looking for information about the QBZ-191. Among the technical specifications, you'll see posts on Reddit and gun forums suggesting the rifle isn't all it's cracked up to be. Do those rumors hold water? Or are they trumped-up efforts to make the QBZ-191 seem worse than it really is? The first reason why there might be some fire to that internet smoke is somewhat philosophical, though there is a practical element to it. One of the main reasons China invested so heavily in the production of the QBZ-95 is that it wanted a rifle that would move it away from its reputation of being a country that simply copies other designs. For all of its faults, the QBZ-95 was Chinese. The QBZ-191 is supposed to represent a huge leap forward in that design philosophy, but that leap may be a little more than a step. To some, China hasn't even moved forward at all. You may have seen hints of this in National Interest's description of the QBZ-191, which essentially follows the design philosophy set by the AR-15 and some European rifles. The truth about guns goes even further. It points out that apart from the China-specific rounds, the QBZ-191 is essentially a variant of the AR-15. It features a similar modular design on both the lower and upper portions of the rifle, with the early prototypes even matching the AR-15's trigger groups. The QBZ-191 also uses a buffer tube and what appear to be variations of Magpul magazines. The only difference, according to The Truth About Guns, lies in the use of a piston instead of direct impingement, but even that isn't as innovative as it first appears. The civilian market for the AR-15 has been experimenting with pistons for years. According to the website, the result is the QBZ-191 is a little more than a copy of an established rifle that's been tweaked a bit before being placed into mass production. In other words, it's exactly what China was doing with its Soviet-inspired weapons during the 20th century. And that raises questions. After all, we know that the Chinese knockoffs of Soviet-era weaponry resulted in a lack of quality control across the board. National Interest pointed out that this was even an issue with the QBZ-95. Shifting into mass production so soon after the QBZ-191's introduction could lead to more of those quality issues, even if the rifle itself is supposed to represent a shift toward greater quality over quantity. There's also the previously mentioned philosophical issue. Can we really consider the QBZ-191 a Chinese rifle? Beijing will certainly say it is, but those in the know will point to its remarkable similarities to the AR-15 as evidence that China hasn't innovated at all. It's simply taken what exists, tweaked it, and claimed it as its own. And therein lies another problem. China claims the QBZ-191 represents the next generation of rifles. That may be the case for the PLA itself. It's been using the unreliable QBZ-95 for decades, so the shift to the QBZ-191 would likely be considered a massive upgrade if the rifle can live up to its specifications released so far. But given how similar the QBZ-191 is to the AR-15, it's clear there is little advancement in actual rifle design at play here. In fact, the QBZ-191 may be even worse than the rifle it's copying. After all, the M16, the military's variant of the AR-15, has a maximum effective range of 1,804 feet.
That's nearly 500 feet more than the QBZ-191. The point here is that China's impressive new rifle may really be yet another example of the country trying to play catch-up. Suppose national interest and the truth about guns are to be believed. In that case, Beijing had essentially built its own version of the AR-15 at a time when the US was actively replacing the M16 variant of that rifle in its military. As of March 2024, the US has officially fielded the Sig Sauer XM250, which is chambered to 6.8mm to give it a greater range and increased lethality against soldiers in body armor compared to the M16. China is playing catch-up to a country that's already moving on from the rifle that inspired the QBZ-191. Of course, some of these criticisms may come off as unfair. China is far from the only country to build elements of the AR-15 or M16 into its rifles, and it likely won't be the last. The problem is that China's march toward modernization isn't progressing fast enough with a rifle that appears to be a close copy of the M16 when its main competitor is already moving on. Then there is the issue of the rounds. China has long proclaimed its 5.8 by 42mm rounds to be superior to the 5.56 by 45mm NATO rounds used in many Western rifles. Beijing says its bullets are better at penetrating armor, offering an increase of 0.39 inches at 980 feet compared to NATO rounds, and that its 5.8 by 42mm rounds retain more speed and fly at a flatter trajectory. All of that is debatable. After all, China introduced the rounds in 1987 and hasn't fought any major conflict using them since then. In other words, there's little actual data about the round's capabilities beyond what China itself claims. That lack of data isn't proof that the QBZ-191 doesn't have the stopping power of an equivalent rifle. However, there does seem to be a problem with these rounds, which could either come down to the rounds themselves or the rifle from which they're being fired. Keyholes. In August 2022, a video surfaced on the r/gun subreddit showing a SWAT team training to use the QBZ-191 in a shoot house clearing situation. The video offers insight into the quality of China's SWAT teams, with the room clearing appearing to lack any corner clearing. The team seems to meander from room to room, pointing their rifles at pre-designated targets rather than actively checking the room to ensure it's cleared properly. However, the biggest issue was seen in the targets that the SWAT team fired. At several points during the video, the SWAT team is seen firing at paper targets with the QBZ-191 rifle, all fairly standard stuff. The shots were taken at a range of about 20 feet, nowhere near the rifle's supposed maximum range, which would be pretty standard for room clearance. Disregarding the accuracy of the shots, as several bullets missed their targets, close-ups of the paper target showed another potential problem. Every round seemed to keyhole the target. For those who aren't aware of what keyholing is, it typically occurs when a bullet is unstable as it exits a rifle's barrel, essentially leading it to tumbling through the air, rather than firing straight at its target. At a distance of 20 feet, the impact of those tumbles is negligible. The round should hit its target so quickly that there are no issues. But over longer distances, a tumbling round creates major problems. Since the round is essentially rotating in the air, it loses the aerodynamic qualities that allow it to maintain velocity and accuracy over a distance. Think of it like trying to throw a dart in reverse. The dart's design isn't made for that type of throw, meaning you'll have to generate a lot more power to get it to a target than you would if you threw it properly. From the video, that appears to be what's happening to the 5.8 by 42mm rounds being fired out of the QBZ-191. The question now is simple: why is this happening? There could be several reasons. The more generous rifle enthusiasts among you might suggest that the Chinese SWAT team used training rounds rather than real 5.8 by 42mm rounds. That's a possibility. Simulated ammunition doesn't act the same way as the real thing, but it's difficult to tell from the video alone. Another possibility is that there are problems with the QBZ-191 itself. Gat Daily did a deep dive on the video, suggesting the keyholing rounds may indicate an unrifled barrel, or at least rifling that doesn't match the weight of the projectile being fired. Either issue would cause tumbling, which suggests the QBZ-191s in the video had been rushed through production or subject to such minimal quality control they're prone to throwing off bullet trajectories simply because they're not built well enough. An age-old problem for China resurfaces. If it truly was a rifle issue, China has a lot of work to do to standardize the production of the QBZ-191, ensuring it reaches an appropriately high standard in the process before it can start equipping soldiers with it. After all, quality control failures would have a massive impact on the battlefield. Rounds tumbling out of rifles massively reduce penetration, rendering one of the supposed advantages of the 5.8 by 42mm rounds moot, as well as reducing the rifle's effective range enormously. Still, there's a possibility that it really was the rounds. Some suggest the SWAT team was using rubber bullets, which would result in the tumbling. Plus, a range test of the QBU-191, the designated marksman variant of the QBZ-191, released in August 2022, seemed to show no evidence of tumbling. However, this does not eliminate the possibility of quality control issues, which could affect the rifle as it's deployed en masse. Speaking of the QBZ-191 being deployed, China has another issue to confront: the sheer size of its army. For all of its faults, the QBZ-95 is a fairly inexpensive gun to manufacture. The QBZ-95 version of the rifle cost 4,300 yuan, around $600 based on modern exchange rates to build. With that low price point being essential given the size of China's army, it has 2.035 million members, according to Global Firepower, as well as around 500,000 reservists. Equipping them all with QBZ-95s cost an estimated $1.52 billion before you consider ammunition. That's a substantial investment. There is no data on how much the QBZ-191 costs to build, but you have to assume it costs more than the QBZ-95. Re-equipping its entire military with the rifle likely cost Beijing upwards of $2 billion. It has the money. China announced a 7.2% increase in its military spending in 2024, reaching $236 billion. However, the country has also a history of not investing in its soldiers, preferring to dedicate its growing budget to developing missiles and other large armaments. Is it possible that Beijing may try to cut corners with its rollout of the QBZ-191? Perhaps. Alternatively, Beijing may be left in a situation where it's trying to rapidly roll out a new rifle to over 2.5 million people, creating an environment in which manufacturing standards drop and quality control, as has so often been the case for China, becomes an issue. China has history in that area. In 2015, E.T. Brooking published an article examining the state of the Chinese army in 2014. It noted that Beijing then had around 2.28 million soldiers on active duty. It's since slashed that number by about 300,000 and a defense budget of $132 billion. The problem was that Beijing spent just $1,523 to outfit each of its soldiers at that time, which is around a 13th of the amount the US spends to outfit one of its soldiers. Most of that money went toward the soldiers' QBZ-95 rifle and helmet, which combined to cost $945. But even then, we see examples of cost cutting. Those helmets, for example, are little different from those issued during World War II, as they're made using steel rather than Kevlar found in most modern military helmets. E.T. Brooking also reported China only issued 2 radio sets per company during that period, and that soldiers don't even receive compasses as standard issue. Compare that to the $20,500 being spent to equip a US soldier at the time, which included spending on advanced protective gear as well as weaponry, and there's a clear disparity. Why does this matter? It shows Beijing's preference for quantity over quality. It also shows China is willing to cut corners when it comes to equipping its infantry. Most of its military budget will, in fact, be dedicated to developing bigger, better weapons, ahead of making sure its people on the ground have what they need. Granted, this was 10 years ago, but if China hasn't modernized its approach to equipping its soldiers, we might find that the rollout of the QBZ-191 is affected by this penny pinching. The rifle itself may or may not be up to a high standard. That's still to be determined. But if China's troops are still as poorly equipped as they were in the past, it might not even matter. A new rifle would do little when so many other problems exist. Of course, the main problem we face in assessing the QBZ-191 is that the rifle isn't available in the US. Since 1993, the rifle's developer, Norinco, has been banned from exporting firearms and ammunition into the US, making it challenging for anybody outside of China to get their hands on the QBZ-191. It's also worth noting, as National Interest points out, Norinco has spent the last couple of decades making what amounts to clones of more famous American guns. The Norinco M305 is a little more than a cloned M14, whereas the Norinco 97 copies the Winchester 1897 design. That brings us back to the QBZ-191. There are already suggestions that it's a little more than a copy of an M16. Given the manufacturer's history, those claims may carry some weight. And if they do, the QBZ-191 goes right back to experiencing the problem that we saw back in China's period of cooperating with and then copying the Soviet Union. It will be operating with a rifle that's an outdated copy of a far superior gun.
Thousands of years ago, an ancient hunter draws his makeshift bow as his target comes into view. The large animal doesn't see the hunter, and the hunter squints his eyes to get the best possible shot. He hopes for the best and lets loose an arrow with the goal of getting some meat in his belly tonight. Today, the highly trained soldier has a very different target in his sights. The enemy commander is a difficult man to pin down, and he knows he'll only get one chance to eliminate him. With a high-powered rifle from over a mile away, he won't be sending his bullet out on a wing and a prayer. He'll be aided by one of the most advanced sniper scopes ever created. How did we get from there to here? This is the history of rifle scopes through the ages. The first ranged weapons didn't have much going for them besides aim and luck. The first was likely a thrown spear or a hatchet that would be lucky to go 50 feet, making only a slight advantage over hunting by hand. Soon, primitive hunters would develop the bow and arrow, with the first example of this early ranged weapon dating back to at least 60,000 years ago. But in terms of hitting the target, these hunters had exactly one tool at their disposal: their eyesight. And aiming at an animal meant you likely only had one shot, because if you missed, the animal would usually get spooked and run or charge. The same went with most early ranged weapons. Whether you were talking about the sharp throwing star of Japan known as the shuriken, the air-propelled dart guns commonly coated with poison, or the self-returning boomerang, they could all do a lot of damage if they were aimed properly. The same went for the more advanced weapons once gunpowder was developed. Whether it was a simple musket or a large booming cannon, you just had to do the best you could to figure out where your target would be and let the ammo fly. And the origins of the next development would come from an unexpected source. For thousands of years, this was just part of warfare. Human eyesight would do the best it could, but there were no certainties. A speck of dust in the eye or a partially foggy day could ruin a mission. There were no tools to aid in shooting until the 1630s, and that was when the first quantum leap came from someone who had nothing to do with warfare. William Gascoigne was an amateur astronomer from England who was experimenting with his telescope and put it in his case to do something else, leaving the case open. And it got an unexpected visitor. A spider crawled inside and spun its web in the case. And when Gascoigne took a look, he got the most dramatic up-close look at a spiderweb anyone had seen in history. After realizing what had happened and possibly making some dramatic, grossed-out noises, Gascoigne realized the arachnid, without proper respect for property rights or personal space, had led to a massive revelation. The spiderweb was in focus with distant objects, and this meant that he could use the same principle to create the first telescopic sight. And that's exactly what he did, building the first prototype. And naturally, it wouldn't be long before people went, "Science schmience, how can we make this useful to us?" The year was 1776, and things were shaken up in the American colonies, to put it lightly. The Americans were outmanned, outgunned, and largely expected to get routed by the British forces once the Revolutionary War kicked off. But one thing they had going for them was a lot of innovative thinkers. Ben Franklin was the most famous, but other inventors like Charles Wilson Peale and David Rittenhouse were also doing their parts for the war effort. These two scientists were the first to have the idea to mount a telescopic sight to a rifle. But first prototypes rarely work out. There was nothing to base a rifle-mounted scope on, and the two designers weren't able to figure out how to mount it forward enough. The scope worked to provide a better view of the target, but when it was fired, the recoil propelled the gun back and the scope directly into the shooter's eye. This was naturally a problem when you need your eyes to shoot, and this first attempt at a rifle scope never made it to the battlefield. Or did it? Later that year, British soldiers described seeing a gun that looked like it had a rifle-mounted scope on it and documented it, but there was no proof what gun they were seeing. But it wouldn't be long before the next big leap. It was 1835, and maybe the early American experiments had given people some ideas. They certainly did to civil engineer John R. Chapman and gunsmith Morgan James. The two men, during a period of relative peace for the U.S., developed what would come to be known as the Chapman-James sight. These were more experiments than anything, but they proved the idea of a telescopic sight could work. And in 1855, an optician named William Malcolm took the next step. He used achromatic lenses similar to the ones used in telescopes and made key adjustments to the position. The result was a scope that could magnify images between 3 and 20 times, creating a major advantage for shooters. And they would be needed soon. As the Civil War kicked off in 1861, the Union and Confederate armies were armed with deadlier weapons than they ever were before. It was the Confederates who first became known for their sharpshooters, often stationing soldiers in trees as they picked off Union soldiers from the sky. It's believed that the only major general killed during the war, Union Commander John Sedgwick, was picked off by a sniper from almost 2,400 feet away.
The Confederates were mainly using scoped rifles imported from England, some of the most expensive weapons in the arsenal and well worth the cost. These rifles were still primitive, but they had a major impact. The scopes were usually simple side-mounted telescopes combining two inventions into one deadly package. Shooters would look through the scope, get a clear picture of what their target was, and then let loose. The real power was the ability to impose long-range fear on enemy troops. It was common for Union troops to wander into what looked like a wide-open battlefield, only for it to turn into a killing field as snipers unleashed fire, picking people off from close to half a mile away. These weapons were a big part of the Confederacy's early successes before the wheels came off, and not just anyone could get their hands on one of these weapons. And naturally, the Union soon got in on the game too. The Union primarily used American-made weapons, which meant supplies could be lower, but cost would be as well. The Union Army used a sharpshooter squad since 1861 and required high standards of this unit. Soldiers needed to pass a marksmanship test to get their hands on one of these weapons, but they then became some of the only soldiers to largely control their own actions. They didn't have to do typical camp chores or drills and could pursue high-value targets at their own pace. But halfway across the world, the future of the rifle scope was being developed. The term sniper was actually developed in Germany, being derived from Scharfschütze or sharpshooter, and the British had been using the weapons heavily in India, where they were often engaged in combat in thick jungle brush. By the time World War I rolled around, both armies were well armed with long-range guns, and this was a recipe for carnage, as both could now pick off enemy soldiers from a mile away in the middle of the largest conflict in human history. And the rifle scopes themselves would evolve as well. The earliest rifle scopes were little more than a telescope strapped to a gun, with the two pieces not exactly working together. However, soon gun designers would figure out new ways to make the two pieces of the weapon work in unison, and the result would be newer and deadlier weapons. Until now, all rifle scopes were simple telescopes that provided a longer view at something far away. But around 1880, a new innovation made its way on the scene: the refractor scope. This was adapted from a new type of telescope that allowed light to pass directly into the eye of the person holding it, making it easier to see in low-light conditions. But it would be a while before they made their way to the battlefield. It took a lot of tinkering, but eventually the lenses were small and sturdy enough to be added to guns. You needed a lens that wouldn't be too big to mount comfortably, but also one that could sustain the recoil of the rifle. And it would be the German army that took the momentum when it came to this new innovation, outfitting their soldiers with some of the most advanced rifle scopes available. Much of World War I was determined by trench warfare, and that gave the Germans an early advantage. And by the time the US Army entered the fray, they had some catching up to do. There was little time to waste, so the US Army set out retrofitting existing guns with the scopes they had on hand. A 6x magnification Warner and Swayze. While this weapon was rather clumsy, it kept the US soldiers from being sitting ducks. This was the first war where sniper scopes weren't a surprising new innovation. They were a common tool that every army was expected to have to keep up. The United States won the war despite being at a disadvantage early on, and that set Germany's weapons development back. But for the US, it was all full steam ahead. Sniper rifles had made a big part of the difference in the past war, and the rifle optical technology was a top priority going forward. The US knew they had to upgrade, and there were three key areas: more powerful scopes that could see further, longer range weapons, and smaller rounds that would cause less wear and tear on the rifle and the user. The primary weapon used during this period was the M16 Rifle, and most were outfitted with a standard 2.5 magnification scope. But snipers were often given a 10x scope created by Unertel, one of the most powerful scopes created at the time and highly effective at bad weather shooting. And it would be a good thing because World War II would be the most sniper-heavy war yet. The Second World War saw heavy ground combat in the European theater, as well as no small amount of fighting in the jungles of Asia against the Japanese Empire. Both posed challenges for shooters in low visibility, but the scopes were up to the task, except in one area. When the sun went down, the shooting largely stopped, at least from the snipers. None of the current rifles were capable of accounting for low-light conditions at night, and being able to shoot from a great distance didn't help if you were looking at pitch-black dark. That's where the Nazi mad scientists came in. The first attempt at a night vision system was created in 1944, as the Nazi war machine debuted the Vampire system. Dramatic name aside, this was a rifle scope that also included an infrared spotlight. This was produced by a heavy battery backpack attached to the gun, which made using the system cumbersome. It was a primitive near-infrared system that couldn't illuminate body heat but could make it easier to notice movement. Despite the drawbacks, the Nazis thought it was promising enough to start using it in combat in February 1945, only months before the war came to an end. But while it didn't work out for the Nazis, there was a lot to build off. The Vampir was initially designed for short-range shooting rather than snipers, but it would be the basis for future developments in night vision. However, it would be a long time before any more quantum leaps were made, simply because they weren't needed. The Korean War, the next major war after World War II, was mostly a brutal close-quarters combat and didn't see the innovation in weapons that the World War saw. However, the end of the war led to one big opportunity for weapons companies on the home front. It was time for the rifle scope to go mainstream. Initially, these long-range weapons were limited to military use, but the 1950s saw them introduced to civilians for the first time. They didn't typically use the most powerful scopes, but hunters were very enthusiastic, because now they could snipe deer without having to worry about getting gored by an angry buck. At first, the scopes typically only had a magnification of up to 6 times, and there was more and more demand for high-quality rifles, and it wouldn't be long before arms companies were putting the most powerful scopes ever onto the market, and these scopes lasted the test of time. These powerful analog refracting scopes were the best of the best, and many of them can still be used today because this was about as good as it got for analog scopes. The Vietnam War played out very differently than the Korean War because the North Vietnamese troops made extensive use of snipers. These savvy soldiers typically didn't have advanced weaponry, but they knew the jungle inside and out, and the US needed to even the odds. Vietnam was the first US war where success in guerrilla warfare was key, and one man would change the sniper game forever. His name was Carlos Hathcock, and the US Marine was already a shooting champion when he was deployed to Vietnam. Armed with the classic M2 machine gun, he managed to obtain a basic telescopic scope, not even the most advanced model, and hooked the two up. In doing this, he took a fast-firing close-range weapon and turned it into the most deadly long-range gun ever created. The big problem? The recoil of the machine gun, which made accuracy challenging for everyone but the best soldiers. And that was exactly what Hathcock would prove to be. Hathcock would become famous, or infamous, for his 93 confirmed sniper kills during the Vietnam War, and he would also set the record at the time for the longest kill ever recorded at over 6,000 feet. While many were initially skeptical about the combo of a high-powered weapon with the sniper scope, the success was impossible to argue with. The extra range combined with the volume of shots meant the army could wipe out an enemy unit from afar. Soon enough, the military was turning this into a standard weapon, and after much experimentation, it became the M16 Rifle. So how did we get from there to today? The US wasn't involved in any major wars for the decades after Vietnam until the millennium, with most conflicts like the Gulf War being against highly outmatched opponents. But there was now a profit motive to keep creating better rifle scopes, both for the military and civilian hunters. The high-powered 10x rifle scopes from military weapons soon became standard on hunting rifles, and designers were able to create smaller scopes that would provide excellent visibility without weighing down the gun. Not only did the glass used become much more advanced, but it became common to replace it with transparent polymers, both lighter and harder to break. And soon it was time for those scopes to go electronic. The original scopes were simple fixed devices, but later versions introduced the concept of variable magnification. This meant that snipers could train their scope on the right perspective depending on how far away their target was and how clear a shot they needed. It made it much easier to pinpoint a target, but nothing as much as this next innovation did. It's probably the most memorable image people remember from TV or movies about snipers. How does a target know a sniper is after him? It's that telltale red dot. The addition of laser sights to sniper rifles makes it easier for the shooter to know exactly where their bullet will hit. This is popular with hunters, and the deer being targeted usually doesn't know what that red dot means. They might even try to lick it off. A human target in a war might be alerted by the red dot, but an effective sniper wouldn't give them the time to get away. Lasers not only give the sniper the opportunity to measure the target, they allow the leader in a squad of snipers to let his men know exactly where to aim. And the need for sniper rifles would be back in full force at the turn of the millennium. When the War on Terror began in 2001, everyone knew it would be a very different war. While there were governments to topple, like the ruthless Taliban of Afghanistan and the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, both fell relatively quickly, and the bulk of the war would be spent fighting scattered terror groups and insurgents in urban areas and isolated mountain regions. Being able to pinpoint enemies with only seconds to spare was often the difference between a clean shot and an al-Qaeda leader disappearing.
So what's the future of sniper scopes? The US is not currently engaged in any wars after its withdrawals from Iraq and Afghanistan, but its hunters are enthusiastic as ever, so the odds are that better but not necessarily bigger scopes will keep on being developed for civilian use. And many of the guns the US sends abroad to Ukraine will likely be equipped with high-powered scopes to help the Ukrainian military take on the Russians from afar. But there might be one thing keeping rifle scopes from being as essential as they were in the past: unmanned drones, because the only thing better than a human sniper being able to take out an enemy from afar is a machine that can do it without putting anyone else at risk. Could robots be putting snipers out of work soon? Not if the snipers currently training have anything to say about it, but they just might be a deadly combo. With global tensions continuing to reach new heights, it's natural to wonder about the militaries who are rapidly preparing for war. When it comes to technology, there is one place where innovation never sits still. That is, of course, weapons technology. Nothing moves the economy quite like war, folks. A rifle is an infantryman's best friend and constant companion. Their very lives and the lives of their comrades depend on the rifle to be accurate and reliable in do-or-die situations. Now more than ever, there's a variety of fantastic rifles available to the militaries of the world, although some are better than others. So which military rifle is the best? Let's dive in. Number 10. At number 10, we have the EF-88 Aussteiger. Its predecessor, the Steyr AUG, was developed by the Austrians in 1977 and made history when it became the first bullpup-style rifle to be put into service in a modern military. Many militaries around the world have adopted it, but it found a real home in the Australian Defence Force, or ADF. First being put into service in 1989, the AUG replaced the M16 and the L1A1 as the main rifle of the ADF. Since 1989, the AUG has been repeatedly improved and upgraded, and the current version in use by the ADF is the enhanced F-88 Aussteiger. Though many generations of the rifle have come and gone, a few pieces remain the same. It's still a bullpup design that has selective fire capabilities, still fires a 5.56 NATO round, is short-stroke piston-operated, and fires from a closed bolt. The barrel is also made through cold hammer forging, similar to how the SCAR rifles are made. This process prolongs durability and allows for more resistance to wear and tear. The enhanced F-88 weighs in at about 7 pounds when empty, has an overall length of 31.5 inches, and a barrel length of 20 inches. It has a 30-round magazine capacity and can fire at a rate of around 850 rounds per minute. Although the soul of the weapon remains the same, it has received significant upgrades over the years, making it even more reliable, accurate, and customizable. Its latest version, the enhanced F-88, has a redesigned stock, a trigger guard, and receiver, making it lighter, more comfortable, and easier to use. In addition to this, the top rail has been lengthened and additional rails have been added, allowing the user to customize the rifle with the technology or attachments necessary to complete a variety of missions. A grenade launcher can even be fitted to the bottom of the weapon for an extra dose of firepower. And if the mission requires stealth, the ADF has been continually improving the silencers used on the EF-88. Known globally to be an accurate and reliable weapon, the only knock against it seems to be a slow and heavy trigger pull. Overall, it's loved by the ADF and many other militaries around the world. Number 9. Moving on to number 9, we now have the SIG MCX, produced by none other than Sig Sauer. This rifle was initially rolled out in 2015 and is now used by many police and special forces units around the world. The MCX comes in a variety of weights and lengths based on the different options for the barrel lengths. The standard barrel length is 16 inches, with the total length varying from 35 and 40 inches, and the whole thing weighs about 8 pounds. Very light and versatile, it features a short-stroke gas piston system that reduces recoil and improves reliability. Users can also convert the rifle to fire different calibers of ammunition. The standard version is built to fire the NATO 5.56 rounds, but it can be changed to fire the 300 AAC Blackout or the 7.62 by 39 mm. These conversions are easy enough to do that they can be performed in the field if needed. The MCX also comes with a 30-round magazine, has a fire rate between 800 and 900 rounds a minute, and an effective range of about 550 yards. Highly customizable, the rifle is able to be outfitted with all the attachments and optics an operator will ever need on its top rail. If stealth is required, the MCX can be equipped with direct thread sound suppressors, which maintain the performance level of the rifle when suppressed. This is a big advantage for special forces units, as no washers or other stabilizers are required.
Hailed as accurate, reliable, and easy to use, it's a great rifle for any operator, especially praised for its accuracy and reduced recoil even when using a suppressor. The only negative people seem to have with it is the skeletonized stock that's available on some versions of the rifle. People claim it's not very comfortable, but this varies from user to user. The MCX has many variants for both civilians and military users and is continuing to grow in popularity. In 2022, the SIG MCX Spear was chosen as the new rifle for the U.S. Army, officially named the XM7. The future is bright for this rifle, but for now it's still being tested to determine whether or not it meets the Army standards before it's issued to soldiers. Number 8. At number 8, we have the Heckler & Koch HK-416. This formidable rifle is currently used by the German Army, the Norwegian military, the United States Marine Corps, the Irish Army Ranger Wing, as well as the French military, who has selected it to replace the domestically developed FAMAS. Production began in 2004, and it's seen ferocious combat all over the world. Its real rise to fame, though, happened after the gun was used by SEAL Team 6 to kill Osama bin Laden in 2011. The HK-416 utilizes a gas-operated short-stroke piston with a rotating bolt and fires the standard NATO round of 5.56. It also comes equipped with a 30-round magazine, weighing in between 8 and 9.85 pounds when fully loaded, and between 28 and 40 inches long, depending on the barrel length you're using. It's a lightweight and portable weapon that's also highly customizable. Instead of just having a rail on top of the rifle, the HK-416 was designed with rails on all sides of its barrel. This allows users to attach a variety of accessories and optics to the rifle, including all the ones that work for an M4. It also supports a grenade launcher attachment such as the M320. Similar to multiple rifles on this list, it also comes with a cold hammer forged barrel. The gun has mostly positive reviews, with most users finding it reliable and accurate. But as with anything, there's always a few issues. Some operators found that using polymer magazines instead of the standard metal ones caused occasional jams. Luckily, this is easily correctable by using the right kind of magazines. The other issue people complain about is the price. This semi-auto civilian version costs around $3,000, not cheap when compared to its counterparts. We can only imagine that the full auto-capable ones being used in the military and police forces around the world are even more expensive, especially once you factor in the optics and the accessories required. The old saying, "you get what you pay for," certainly applies here. If you have the cash, you will get a great firearm, or just join the Marines and you'll get paid to shoot it. Your call. Number 7. Looking ahead at number 7, we have a newcomer on the scene, the KS Carbine. The KS-1, or Night Stoner Carbine, is an AR-15 style rifle that was selected in 2022 to replace the L85A2A3 and the L119A1A2 that were being used by special operations units and elements of the British Royal Marines. This rifle is still being rolled out and tested, so expect more improvements in the years to come. The KS rifle comes in a few different varieties based on barrel length. The most common version is the KS-1, which features a 13.7-inch barrel and shoots, you guessed it, the NATO 5.56. The rifle also features a highly efficient direct gas impingement system and a rotating bolt. Weighing in at about 7 pounds and measuring between 32 to 34 inches, the KS-1 is on par with many other modern rifles. It's currently only available in semi-automatic, so its fire rate is based on the user, but its effective range remains similar to other rifles on our list at about 550 yards. Like the HK-416, it also has a cold hammer forged barrel that's ready for the rigors of modern combat. The KS-1 also comes with a top rail for various optics, including a Wilcox flip mount on every rifle, which allows the user to engage targets at a variety of distances. The suppressor that it utilizes is of a flow-through design, which means all the gas from the round being fired is sent outward, not back at the shooter. The pressure reduction technology it uses decreases the sound of the rifle firing by about 12 decibels, as well as reducing the flash it creates. Unlike a lot of AR-15 rifles, the KS-1 is fully ambidextrous, so not only can users fire the rifle from their dominant side, but in the event of an injury or incapacitation, the user can switch to the other side. Great in theory, but how many ambidextrous shooters are there? One advantage of the rifle pointed out by the Royal Marines was that the weight distribution was greater in the front of the weapon versus the back, as it was in previous rifles. This allows users to handle the weapon easier and gives them more flexibility. So far, it seems as though it's a dependable and intuitive rifle that'll serve the armed forces of the UK for some years to come, but time will tell if it measures up to its first impression. Number 6. Number 6 is the MKE MPT-55, a Turkish rifle that was designed in 2009. The MPT-55 went into production at the beginning of 2014, with a design somewhat based on the AR-15. Though mostly used by the Turkish military, it's seen use in multiple other militaries and police forces in Europe and Africa. Throughout its service life, it's proven its quality amongst Turkish troops, as they carried it into battle in conflicts across the Middle East. The name MPT is an acronym in Turkish, but in English it translates to National Infantry Rifle. During the design process, the Turkish army made it clear that they wanted a rifle that would be durable and reliable at all altitudes and in all weather. So far, it seems that the final product has exceeded those expectations. It uses a gas-operated rotating bolt action, similar to that of the M4 and M16. In terms of weight, it matches most of the other rifles on our list, at 7.9 pounds without the magazine and measures 37.5 inches overall. Light and agile, the rifle can handle both rural and urban combat. Unsurprisingly, the MPT-55 shoots the NATO standard 5.56 and comes equipped with a 30-round magazine. It's accurate up to 550 yards and has a rate of fire between 750 and 850 rounds a minute. Similarly to the KS-1, the MPT-55 is also ambidextrous and customizable with a rail system, so it's friendly to optics as well as iron sights. The rail system even allows for an under-barrel shotgun or a grenade launcher attachment. This versatility can make the MPT-55 a huge asset to any rifle platoon seeking versatility and reliability. Popular amongst soldiers and policemen alike, it's often praised for its accuracy and reliability, especially in adverse weather conditions. On the other hand, it is fairly long, so it might not handle as well in close-quarters combat as some of the other smaller rifles. It's got mostly positive feedback from its users, but one thing to note was that due to the manufacturer being on the smaller side, it might be harder to get parts if you're outside of Turkey. This stands in contrast to the global reach of massive brands like Heckler & Koch or Sig Sauer. That's not to say that getting spare parts or fixing broken ones is impossible. It might just be more difficult than when going with a rifle from one of the giants of the firearm industry. Overall, it is reliable and a deadly firearm that'll be used by the Turkish military for many years to come. Number 5. Coming in at number 5, the formidable FN SCAR. The Special Operations Combat Assault Rifle, or SCAR as it's commonly known, is a beast of a weapon. First produced in 2004, it's currently in use in 20 countries around the world and is a favorite of many special operations and elite police groups. It saw extensive combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as many other conflicts globally. It comes in 2 versions, the SCAR Light, which fires the NATO 5.56 round, and the SCAR Heavy, which fires the larger 7.62. Like other rifles on the list, it also features a gas-operated short-stroke piston and a rotating bolt. The 2 versions are very similar statistically, but there are a few differences. The SCAR Light has a higher fire rate, 650 rounds per minute, while the SCAR Heavy has a longer effective range at 660 yards. The SCAR Heavy also has a smaller magazine, only capable of holding 20 rounds, whereas the lighter version can hold 30. There's not much difference in weight or length between the two either, with the SCAR Heavy weighing in at 7.9 pounds and the SCAR Light weighing in at 7.3. The difference in length is only 3 inches in favor of the SCAR Heavy. Both versions of the SCAR have a top and bottom rail for optics and tech, as well as iron sights that a lot of users say are first-rate. They both also come with a folding stock, and while other rifles have those as well, it adds to the versatility of an already dynamic firearm. Users can also attach a grenade launcher to the bottom, specifically the FN40GL. The drawbacks are few, but the main ones are the wear and tear it puts on the optics and the price. The SCAR is known to be hard on cheaper, more fragile optics because of its recoil, especially with the heavy version. The price is also a major pain, as the civilian version is close to $4,000. One can only assume that a fully decked-out Special Operations one is even higher, but if Uncle Sam's footing the bill, go for it. For small governments, militaries, and police forces, this is probably a little outside their budget, at least on a large scale. The SCAR is legendary for its ruggedness and reliability in combat. No wonder it's a favorite of some of the most elite combat forces on the planet. Number 4. Moving on to number 4, we have the Tavor TAR-21. It was designed by Israel Weapon Industries to replace the Galil M16 and M4. In service with the IDF since 2001, the Tavor family of rifles, specifically the TAR-21, is currently on the ground with Israel's soldiers in their war against Hamas. Besides the IDF, the TAR-21 is currently used in many smaller militaries around the world, such as Honduras and Thailand. Unlike most of the other rifles on the list, the TAR-21 uses a long-stroke piston system and a closed rotating bolt, similar to those used in the AK-47 and the M1 Garand. Although there are many variations of it, the standard issue weighs at just over 7 pounds and measures 28.3 inches long. Its shorter length allows for better maneuverability in close-quarters combat, aided by the bullpup design, which offers a more balanced weight distribution, reducing fatigue during lengthy engagements. That is great, but if you're switching to it from a more traditional AR-style rifle, it might take some getting used to. Like many other rifles, it has a rail system that allows for optics or other attachments to be added based on the user's preferences. There's also a variant that accepts an M203 grenade launcher known as the GTAR-21. It fires the NATO standard 5.56 round from a 30-round magazine at a rate between 750 and 950 rounds a minute. With an effective range of about 600 yards and ambidextrous capabilities, the Tavor TAR-21 is a deadly and versatile assault rifle. It isn't for everyone, though. The price alone makes it a no-go for smaller groups or governments. The vents are also located right beneath the shooter's face, so as the fight goes on, users end up continually inhaling gases or even ejected debris from the weapon. This problem can be made even worse when suppressed. The Tavor TAR-21 was designed to conquer the adverse conditions on the battlefield and maintain its status as a durable, reliable, and easily maintained rifle. Overall, it's a solid weapon that will stay in service for years to come. Number 3. Number 3 takes us all the way to the other side of the globe, to the ranks of the People's Liberation Army and their main rifle, the QBZ-95. The rifle came out of the ashes of the Gulf War, where many Iraqi soldiers were using Chinese-made weapons. Their incredibly rapid defeat sent Chinese designers back to the drawing board, recognizing that they needed a rifle suited for a 21st century battlefield, something to allow the PLA to remain competitive on the world stage. Introduced in 1997, it's a short-stroke piston, gas-operated rotating bolt assault rifle with a bullpup design. Part of the unique design is its striker firing mechanism, meaning the hammer, firing pin, and the bolt are all one piece. While this allows for easier maintenance, it's also brought on some mechanical problems for the rifle. The QBZ-95 weighs in at just over 7 pounds when fully loaded and measures 29.3 inches in length. It also has a 30-round capacity magazine and an effective range of about 440 yards with a fire rate of 650 rounds a minute. With selective fire capabilities, the QBZ-95 is a versatile rifle capable of handling any situation. It also comes in a couple of variants, including a light machine gun and a carbine version. It's also the first rifle on this list to shoot a caliber exclusively used by a specific nation, being loaded with the Chinese military's unique 5.8 by 42 mm round. As this ammunition is produced in China and the details of the process are kept a secret, not much is known about it. Chinese experts estimate that it might be slightly better than the 5.56 ammunition due to its greater energy output from the extra gunpowder contained in the cartridge. Given that China has not fought a serious war since 1979, the 5.8 by 42 mm round is yet to endure trial by fire necessary to give detailed feedback about its performance. So for now, we'll take what the experts say at face value. The QBZ-95 is another rifle on this list made with an ambidextrous design, which is a definite plus, but it's received negative feedback for its clunky trigger pull and lack of customization options. On the upside, the QBZ-95 can shoot rifle grenades and is manufactured with a mount for the Chinese-made QLG-91B grenade launcher. Overall, the QBZ-95 is a capable and lethal battle rifle when in the right hands, but time will tell how well it fares in a prolonged heat of battle. Number 2. For our number 2 spot, we have a modern take on a genuine classic. The AK-12 is the modern version of the timeless AK-47. Did you really think we'd leave the AK family off the list? That would be like leaving Monet out of the Impressionist Museum. The AK-47 was created right after the end of the Second World War and became the standard for assault rifles for years to come. From the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan, the AK proved time and again that it's accurate, deadly, and reliable enough to take a beating and still come back in swinging. Its most recent version, the AK-12, is currently seeing combat in Ukraine with the Russian forces there, but also various other Eastern European countries. Like the TAR-21, the AK-12 uses a gas-operated long-stroke piston with a rotating bolt and also comes with a cold hammer forged barrel. It's about 37 inches in length and weighs between 7 and 8 pounds. Although the standard rifle is equipped to fire the most common caliber round found in Russia, the 5.45 by 39 mm, it does come in a range of variants that are able to fire a variety of other common rounds used by modern armies. The AK-12 comes standard with a 30-round magazine, but higher capacity magazines are becoming available as well. It can shoot at a rate of 600 to 800 rounds a minute with an effective range of around 550 yards. It's equipped with an upper and lower rail system, making the rifle customizable and versatile. It can also support an underbarrel grenade launcher known as the GP25 or GP34 that shoots a 40mm grenade. People will struggle to find much wrong with this rifle, but some of the main complaints are that when it's loaded down with accessories and gear, all that weight can cause fatigue to set in faster. Not really a complaint unique to the AK-12, but it is worth noting. The only other knock against it is the availability. Russia is currently keeping most of them for their own military and that of their allies or regional partners, so don't expect to see one in your local gun store anytime soon. The AK family is a fan favorite, and the AK-12 will prove to be no different in the years to come. Known for its ability to handle harsh conditions and require little maintenance, the rifle carries on the AK family legacy of being about as tough as they come. Number 1. Rounding out this list at number 1, we have the formidable, battle-tested, and deadly workhorse of the US military, the M4. This might not surprise you, but there is a reason this rifle well and truly deserves the number 1 spot on the list. The M4 has been the US military's primary rifle for over 2 decades, as well as seeing service in many other countries around the world. Developed in the 80s and 90s, it began to gain traction with soldiers after the Battle of Mogadishu, when many Rangers complained that in urban combat, the M16 was too long and unwieldy. After that, it saw widespread use in the War on Terror, as well as other smaller conflicts in every corner of the globe. After proving itself for many years, it eventually went on to become the main rifle of the US military. Shooting a 5.56mm round from a 30-round magazine, the M4 is a lightweight carbine that uses the Stoner gas system as well as a closed rotating bolt. Like many other rifles on our list, the M4 is also equipped with a cold hammer forged barrel, weighing in at 7.75 pounds when fully loaded and measuring 33 inches long. It's light enough to be carried into combat with a full pack without fatiguing its users. With an effective firing range of 550 yards and a maximum fire rate of 970 rounds a minute, the M4 allows the shooter to be efficient and accurate in both short and long-range situations. Its next-generation variant, the M4A1, sought to build on its predecessor and features a fully automatic fire rate, a more consistent trigger pull, steel or polymer magazines, and a heavier barrel for improved accuracy. The M4 is also very customizable, with many options available to the user, including a range of optics, attachments, M320 grenade launchers, as well as the Master Key and M26 mass shotguns. While the M4 is a favorite among most soldiers and Marines, it isn't without its issues. The shorter barrel was the source of some complaints, with some claiming it impacted long-range accuracy. The shorter barrel is also prone to overheating during prolonged firefights, further impacting the rifle's accuracy the longer the battle goes on. Soldiers also noted that the older aluminum magazines can dent rather easily, leading to them not functioning properly. They also said that when fighting in places with a lot of sand, like Iraq and Afghanistan, the rifle requires near constant cleaning and maintenance to stay in fighting shape. The M4's Bulldog design has well and truly stood the test of time, with many weapon designers being inspired by its design, leading to a slew of modern weapon designs borrowing parts of this iconic rifle. On top of that, its decades of combat experience cannot be overlooked. Tried and tested, the M4 is truly a great rifle that will continue to be used all over the world for a long time. Since first being developed in 1540, the rifle has been a mainstay of practically every war. When troops are on the ground, they'll always have a trusty rifle in their hands. With any other firearms being backups or special use weapons, rifles win wars. And when it comes to two of the most important wars that America has ever been involved in, World War II and the Vietnam War, the rifles they used often made the difference between victory and defeat. That's why there was constant development of rifle technology between World War II and Vietnam. Which brings us to the subject of this video. Which rifles were used in these two historic conflicts? And how did those used in the Vietnam War differ from the rifles that became emblematic during World War II? That's the question we aim to answer here. But first, a caveat. Covering every single rifle used in both wars would result in this video running for several hours and lead to discussions on rifles that made very little difference on the battlefield. Instead, we've picked a small selection of rifles, 6 from World War II and 5 from the Vietnam War. In both cases, these rifles were either the most commonly used, making them the most important, or had a special role to play in the war, even if they fell out of favor later. Let's start by looking at the 6 most important rifles of World War II. The M1 Garand. When a figure as important as General George Patton calls a rifle the greatest battle implement ever devised, you know it has to be something special. And in the M1 Garand, the United States certainly had a special rifle. Developed primarily by John Garand, the chief civilian engineer at Massachusetts Springfield Armory, the M1 was a gas-operated 30-caliber rifle that was introduced to the U.S. Army in 1936. And it had one key advantage over almost every other standard-issue rifle used in World War II. It was semi-automatic. Where other soldiers had to manually load a new round after firing, the M1 was capable of loading a fresh cartridge into the firing chamber as soon as the user fired. The result was a rifle that enabled the soldier to fire off more rounds quicker than their opponent could, as well as one that enabled the soldier to focus more on the battlefield. After all, in a shootout, the soldier who knows they have 8 rounds that'll automatically be loaded and ready to fire will always have the advantage over the one who has to stop after each round to reload. Those 8 rounds were fed into the Garand via a small clip, with the rifle itself weighing just 9.5 pounds. That made it light enough to strap over a shoulder without weighing soldiers down. As for the autoloading mechanism, the secret to that lay in a gas port located on the underside of the rifle's barrel. That port fed propellant gases into a cylinder that controlled the loading mechanism, which, along with the force of a bullet being fired out of the chamber, allowed the Garand to switch to a new round seconds after the chambered round was fired. The only small problem with the rifle came early in its development. Infamously, the first iterations of the M1 Garand tended to jam at every 7th round. The issue lay in the loading of the clip's top round. If it came in from the right, the gun would jam. But if it was loaded from the left, the rifle wouldn't jam. That served as a temporary fix while the rifle was being showcased, with a more permanent solution coming from an assistant foreman at Springfield named Walter Campbell. When examining the guide rails built into the rifle to keep the clip in place, he discovered that a small nub present on the left fore guide rail wasn't on its right side equivalent. It had been removed to fit the barrel into the M1's receiver. A switch to welding the guide rails to replace the lost nub solved the 7th round jamming problem, and the United States went on to manufacture over 5 million M1s. However, as important as the M1 Garand would prove to be, it wasn't the only rifle that helped the U.S. come out on top during World War II. The M1 Carbine. While the Garand was produced a couple of years before the start of World War II, the M1 Carbine was developed when the war was in full swing. Production started in June 1940 when the U.S. identified the need for a lighter rifle than the Garand, which could be used by support troops including medics, MPs, and officers. Basically, anybody who was considered at risk from a German attack but would be unable to shoulder a full-sized Garand needed something lighter and easier to manage. That was the M1 Carbine. Though often considered a small semi-automatic variant of the Garand, the Carbine could fire a 30-caliber Winchester round. Though that is comparable to the Garand, the Carbine was closer to a pistol than its sister rifle. It had an effective range of 300 yards, half that of the Garand, with its rounds moving at a rate of 1,900 feet per second, or FPS, compared to the Garand's 2,700. However, the Carbine could hold more rounds. It featured a detachable magazine containing 15 rounds, which could be removed and reinserted at will, with post-World War II variants of the rifle introducing the banana magazine that upped its round count to 30. At 35 inches, it was about 8 inches shorter than the Garand, with its unloaded weight of around 5.5 pounds also making it much easier to shoulder. It also used a gas-actuated loading system, which drove the slide rearward to operate the rifle's bolt, which then ejected the loaded round, followed by its casing, to allow the rifle to automatically load the next round. The rifle entered into military service in 1942, with over 6 million eventually being produced. With the 1-2 punch of the Garand and the Carbine, the United States had a pair of rifles that ensured every soldier on the ground, no matter their role, could protect themselves. Of course, though America had the most impressive rifles of the war, their allies and enemies had guns of their own. And when it came to America's British and Canadian compatriots, there was a much different rifle that ruled the roost: the Lee Enfield rifle. With far more limited resources, as well as the fact that they faced a much more imminent threat from the Nazis,
Britain didn't have the ability to pump money into developing fancy new semi-automatic rifles. Instead, they relied on an old faithful, the Lee Enfield rifle. Introduced in 1895, the rifle had been a key armament for Britain's Commonwealth forces, as well as itself during the height of the British Empire. Later, the rifle became standard issue for its forces during World War I, with only small variations being made before it also became standard British issue in World War II. The Lee Enfield was a bolt-action rifle fed by a 10-round magazine, meaning it held 2 more rounds than America's famous Garand. However, each round had to be loaded manually by pulling back on the rifle's bolt, leading to a lower firing rate. The Mark III version of the rifle, which was introduced in 1917, but still the rifle of choice for Brits in World War II, could fire a .303 round and had a maximum range of 2,500 yards. But don't let that maximum range fool you. According to the National Army Museum, the gun's effective killing range was about 600 yards, putting it right in line with the M1 Garand. It also fired about as quickly as any bolt-action rifle in the war. The National Army Museum claims that a well-trained soldier could fire off 15 rounds per minute, leading some Germans to believe that they were dealing with machine gun fire during World War I. That misconception was shattered by the time World War II came around, though the Enfield was still fast and reliable, enough to prove it an effective weapon. In fact, the Enfield was so trustworthy that the Bangladeshi police still issued it as standard deep into the 2000s. Still, it wasn't the only bolt-action rifle used during the war. Germany had their own, though whether it was superior to the Enfield is up for debate. The Mauser Karabiner 98K. Upon becoming Germany's chancellor, Adolf Hitler quickly chose to leave the League of Nations, followed swiftly by his announcement that he intended to expand the Wehrmacht, the German army, to a staggering 600,000 members. These soldiers would need to be armed, which led to Hitler tasking the German army's weapons developers, the Heereswaffenamt, with creating a new rifle that would become standard issue for the country's troops. The Mauser Karabiner 98K, or K98K, was the result. Introduced to the German army in 1935, the rifle quickly became the de facto choice for German troops. It used the Mauser M98 system and was a bolt-action rifle capable of holding an internal magazine carrying 5 7.92 by 57 mm rounds, roughly rounding up to 8 mm. Speaking of that bolt action, Mauser cleverly replaced the straight bolt handle seen on the Gewehr 98, Germany's previous standard issue rifle, with a turned-down handle that made it easier to quickly operate the bolt. Still, the rifle was held back by having such a small cartridge. Both the Garand and the Enfield could hold more rounds in a single clip, meaning German soldiers faced more risk of being caught with an empty gun than their Allied enemies. It made up for that shortcoming with a range of accessories. The rifle was compatible with a 9-inch S84 97-3 bayonet, making it surprisingly handy in close-quarters combat. Soldiers could also fit their SG-42 combat knives as makeshift bayonets, though these knives were in pretty short supply. And in 1942, the Germans developed the Scheissbecher, or shooting cup, grenade launcher attachment, which could fit any K98K. Add to that the ZF-41 optical sight, which added weight to the rifle but allowed it to be used similarly to a heavy scout rifle, and you had a surprisingly versatile gun. It may not have topped the rifles the Allies had at their disposal, but it is no surprise that the Soviets claimed millions of K98Ks upon the war's conclusion. Nevertheless, the Nazis knew they had to come up with a rifle that could match the semi-automatic capabilities of the M1 Garand. And with the next rifle on the list, they may have found that new gun. Though it arrived so late in the war, it wasn't capable of turning the tide in Germany's favor. The Gewehr 43. Once Hitler saw the power of the M1 Garand on the battlefield, he naturally gave the order for Germany to develop its own semi-automatic rifle. 2 guns came from this demand, the G41M from Mauser and the G41W developed by Walther Arms. Neither rifle cut the mustard, with both experiencing reliability problems that led to them jamming in combat. It wasn't until Germany invaded the Soviet Union that it got its hands on the SVT-40, Russia's semi-automatic rifle, which Walther Arms had a chance to examine. They saw that the SVT-40 used a simple and superior gas system, which they were able to combine with their G41W design to create the Gewehr 43. Capable of firing 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser rounds, the rifle measured 44.5 inches, making it slightly longer than the Garand, and weighed in at 9.7 pounds when it was unloaded. Importantly, it had a 10-round box magazine, allowing it to fire off 2 more shots than the Garand before reloading, though the Germans occasionally used 20-round magazines. But despite the higher capacity, the Gewehr 43 was never considered to be superior to the M1 Garand.
It was certainly an improvement over the SVT-40 that inspired it, as well as being well liked by the German troops who had a chance to wield it. However, the gun didn't really meet the quality standards established by the Allies. Parts had a habit of breaking more often, with many deeming the rifle a rush job in hindsight. That's no surprise. The Germans developed it midway through the war and didn't have the time to tweak the design or manufacturing process, leading to an inferior rifle. Nevertheless, 400,000 of these rifles were produced before the Nazis fell, and though it never became Germany's counterpoint to America's semi-automatic rifles, its design did inspire rifles that came later, including one we'll cover in our Vietnam list. It couldn't quite match up to the reliability of the final rifle in our World War II list, though, the Mosin Nagant. The Soviet Union's standard-issue rifle had several parallels with Britain's Lee Enfield rifles. Like the Enfield, the Mosin Nagant was created during the late 19th century, entering into service in 1891, 4 years before the Brits developed the Enfield. It was a bolt-action rifle too, though the original version was only capable of firing a single 10.7 by 58mm R black powder cartridge before it needed to be reloaded. The introduction of the Lee Enfield quickly showed the Russians that they needed a rifle capable of firing multiple rounds before reloading, and by the time World War II rolled around, the Mosin Nagant had been modified to the point where it could accept a 5-round magazine. Still not as good as the Enfield, and nowhere near as good as the Garand, but good enough for standard issue. The Mosin Nagant also had a huge upside. It was reliable. Red Army engineers had modified the original design so much that by 1930 they managed to properly calibrate its sights and shorten the gun a few inches from its original length of 51 inches. Combined with the 5-round magazine, this new variation of the gun was named the Model 9130 and was given to millions of Red Army conscripts during the war. Jams were rare, and the rifle was extremely accurate, so much so that it could be fitted with a PU rifle scope to transform it into a makeshift sniper rifle. The 9130 wasn't perfect. For example, a later version, the M44, introduced a permanently mounted bayonet that could fold away when it wasn't needed. However, that version of the gun didn't see wide production. As for the 9130, almost 20 million of them had been produced by the end of World War II, making it one of the most widely used rifles in history. And with that, our examination of 6 of the most important rifles of World War II is complete. Before moving on to the rifles used in the Vietnam War, we should note that several of these guns were still very much in use by the time the Vietnam War started in earnest. The M1 carbine, for instance, was introduced into Vietnam by the French and became a regularly used rifle on both sides during the war. Still, the conflict in Vietnam marked the last hurrah for battle rifles that were so common in World War II. However, this category of rifle did see one last use on the American side, at least for a short while, with the first gun on our Vietnam list, the M14. Earlier, we mentioned that Germany's Gewehr 43 served as the inspiration for several rifles that came after it. The M14 was one of those rifles. Often viewed as a rifle that combined the best features of the M1 Garand with the M1 carbine, the M14 was the last battle rifle that Springfield Armory produced for the United States military. A selective fire rifle, it officially became the standard issue for the U.S. military in 1957, though not all branches were quick to adopt it. The Marine Corps, for instance, didn't start using the M14 until 1965. With a magazine capacity of 20 rounds, it could hold more than twice the bullets of the M1 Garand that it replaced, and at 44.3 inches, it was a comparable length, with its 875-yard range, meaning that troops could kill at a higher distance with the M14's 7.62 by 51mm NATO rounds. There was just one problem: it was heavy. At just over 12 pounds with equipment, the rifle was difficult to lug around. But the weight was even more of a problem on the battlefield, especially once it was switched to full auto mode. The idea here was that the M14 would be a replacement for several American guns, the Garand and the Browning automatic rifle included. But its weight made it extremely difficult to handle in full auto mode. Add to that some malformed bolts and a weak receiver, and it's perhaps no surprise that the M14 fell out of favor in 1964 for the rifle that's up next on the list. But its story didn't end there. Though some commentators consider the M14 a failure, with national interest going so far as to call it an oversized M1 carbine, the rifle found a second life after Vietnam. It was still used in basic training up until the mid-1970s, and its variants became favorites of snipers for years afterward. The M14 also served as the basis for the M21 and the M25 sniper rifles. So the rifle wasn't completely useless, it just wasn't fit for purpose in Vietnam, which is where our next gun comes in, the M16. With the weighty M14 needing to be replaced and assault rifles becoming the norm in military combat, the US needed something better. They found it in the M16, which was selected as the replacement for the M14 in 1964. Weighing in at just 6.4 pounds, the rifle has variable magazines with 20 and 30 round versions available and could achieve a practical rate of fire between 40 and 100 rounds per minute. It was easier to handle thanks to its lower weight, making its full auto mode practical in the jungles of Vietnam. And though the 5.56 by 45mm round it fired had less stopping power than the M14's bigger rounds, they were still effective. In 1964, the M16 entered the Vietnam War for use in the jungle environments, and by 1969 it had replaced the M14 as the standard issue rifle for the United States military. There was a lot of love about the rifle too. Reinforcements around the magazine holder led to fewer loading issues, while a chrome-plated bore made it sturdy. It also used fiberglass rather than wood, one of the first American-made guns to do so, leading it to weighing less than the M14 and perhaps being a little sturdier. But compromises were made. Military Today says the original version of the M16 had a 460-meter effective range, just over half that of the M14. And according to National Interest, some veterans of the Vietnam War preferred the M14 because of its sheer stopping power. Still, the rifle proved extremely popular, with total worldwide production of it and its later variants reaching about 8 million. But some will tell you that it wasn't the best assault rifle to make its way to the Vietnam War. That title may go to an equally famous Russian equivalent, the AK-47. Toward the end of World War II, the Nazis pioneered the development of the STG-44, the world's first assault rifle. It entered the war in 1942 and was produced until 1944, being rolled out to German troops during that year. The rifle offered increased firing power, which might have been useful to the Germans at the beginning of the war when they were resource-rich and could afford to expend enormous amounts of ammo. But by the time the STG-44 entered the fray, Nazi Germany was on its last legs, with major supply difficulties often meaning that soldiers switched it out for other rifles. Still, it was a huge advancement, and it caught the attention of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin wanted a better assault rifle for the Soviets in the wake of World War II, and the task of designing it fell to Mikhail Kalashnikov. Inspired by the Germans' work on the STG-44, he got to work on what would become the AK-47, which was accepted by the Soviets in 1947 and became their rifle of choice a couple years later. Capable of firing a 7.62mm round with a curved magazine that held 30 rounds, the AK-47 was a revelation. It became one of the most popular shoulder weapons in the world, fated for its reliability, even if the rifle was less accurate than the semi-autos that had come before it. But we know what you're thinking. The AK-47 was a Russian weapon, so what was it doing in Vietnam? The simple answer is that the Soviet Union, along with China, funneled weapons into North Vietnam because they wanted to encourage the spread of communism throughout Asia. Thus, the weapon essentially became standard issue for the North Vietnamese Army, or the NVA, along with the Viet Cong and various smaller military groups that joined to fight off the American threat. That usage led to the AK-47 having an enduring legacy, with nationalistic and guerrilla movements often adopting it as their weapon of choice. As much for its symbolism as its practicality, over 100 million AK-47s have been made, only half being built in Russia, and you could argue that America's development of the M16 was a direct result of this rifle's use in Vietnam. Beyond this Russia-provided weapon, the NVA and its affiliates tended to use whatever rifles they could get their hands on, in some cases manufactured crude copies of those rifles for their troops. So we turn our attention back to the rifles their opponents used, with our next entry being standard issue for the forces that often aren't credited with their role in the Vietnam War, the L1A1 self-loading rifle. Though the Vietnam War is often seen as an American conflict, the US has some help from forces deployed from Australia and New Zealand, with the former joining the conflict in 1965. At its peak, the Australian contingent in Vietnam numbered 8,300 men, most of whom were armed with a rifle of Enfield design, the L1A1 self-loading rifle. The British-made version of Belgium's FN-FAL rifle, the L1A1 was first produced under license in 1954 and was in service of the Australian Army until 1988. It measured about 46.5 inches, with a long 21-inch barrel, and weighed 11.02 pounds when empty, giving it similar specifications to the M14 that the US rejected midway through the Vietnam War. Like the M14, it fired the 7.62 by 51mm NATO round, though its effective range of 547 yards was shorter. However, unlike many of the other rifles used in the war, the L1A1 was semi-auto only, making it the closest rifle, at least in terms of operation,
to those used in World War II. But even a semi-automatic rifle can be deadly in the right hands. In fact, We Are the Mighty claims that the NVA feared Australian troops more than they feared the Americans, likely because the Aussies used many of their favored ambush and booby-trapping techniques against them. And even when the opposing troops came face-to-face, as they did at Firebase Coral Balmoral and Bin Ba, the Australians had a habit of coming out on top. So the L1A1 may be seen as somewhat outdated in comparison to its American equivalents in the Vietnam War. Nevertheless, it was clearly effective, even if some of the tales of the NVA fearing the Aussies are slightly embellished. And it was far from the only rifle seemingly inspired by those used in World War II to see regular use in the war, the M2 carbine. While American troops were getting kitted out with the latest and greatest in their country's military technology, the country's South Vietnamese allies had to make do with rifles that were used in World War II. The M1 Garand and the M1 carbine were both common rifles for the South Vietnamese military, or the SVA. With the former also being used by the few South Koreans who entered the war, the SVA also used another version of the carbine, the M2. The M2 carbine had been considered something of a stopgap rifle for the Americans. Developed in 1944 as a direct response to the fully automatic weapons coming out of Germany, the rifle is essentially an automatic version of the M1 carbine. It could fire faster, achieving a cyclic firing rate of 750 rounds per minute, and had a reinforced butt to go along with its larger magazine. But it barely saw any use during World War II. It was a feature of the Battle of Okinawa, but the war was practically over by the time the M2 carbine was finished. It would later see much heavier use in the Korean War, being especially useful for laying down suppressing fire to counteract ambushes, which is likely why the SVA adopted it for Vietnam. The M2 carbine also saw some use among American soldiers, with some preferring it to the M14 and the M16, as both of those newer rifles had occasional teething problems. In particular, the U.S. chopper crews and special forces had an early preference for the M2 carbine. Still, it was eventually phased out, though it stands as an extremely portable rifle that saw heavy use and was something of a bridge between the semi-automatics of World War II and the assault rifles used so heavily in the Vietnam War. And it's perhaps there that we see the biggest difference in the rifles used in World War II compared to Vietnam. In the former, bolt-action and revolutionary semi-automatic rifles were the weapons of choice, with fully automatic rifles coming so late in the conflict that they didn't become emblematic of the war. But by the time the Vietnam War rolled around, fully automatic rifles, or at least rifles that offered the option between semi and fully automatic, were the standard. World War II rifles were still used, especially by the NVA and the Viet Cong, both of which often had to scavenge what they could find until they started receiving direct support from the Soviet Union. Militaries worldwide employed a wide range of infantry weapons to take out targets. Still, a strong weapon is needed when that target is far away or protected behind some type of cover or armor. For these situations, militaries have produced some of the world's most powerful sniper rifles to easily take out long-range targets no matter how tough they are. Before diving into the rifles, we should note that several factors were taken into consideration when making this list. First and foremost, the rifle had to be chambered in anything above a standard infantry round to be considered powerful. Cartridges like the venerable 7.62 by 51mm and 7.62 by 54R certainly pack a punch, but are outclassed by stronger rounds. Another crucial factor was that most of these rifles were designed to be dual-purpose anti-personnel and anti-material rifles. Engineers designed these incredibly powerful rounds to have enough energy to take out enemy soldiers at super long distances after punching through things like vehicles, bunkers, and even light armored vehicles with ease. With those formalities out of the way, let's jump in and take a look at some of the world's biggest and most powerful sniper rifles in service today. But first, we want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Enlisted, a totally new kind of multiplayer first-person shooter that blends PvP and PvE combat in a truly unique way, where you'll lead your squad of customizable AI soldiers into massive battles against other players with hundreds of targets. There's multiple different campaigns from the outskirts of Moscow in 1941 to the heart of Berlin in 1945, and a massive arsenal of weapons, tanks, and aircraft to unlock, from famous tanks like the M4 Sherman to obscure guns like the prototypes that would become the STG-44. My favorite part of Enlisted is just how accurately they've recreated that equipment and the feeling of warfare. Basic infantry go down quick, and vehicles have realistic damage models, which makes for intense, immersive battles that are still tons of fun. Enlisted has just released their new Pacific campaign, and it's available to play right now on both current and last-gen PlayStation and Xbox consoles, as well as on PC. So download it right now using our link in the description and register to receive a bonus pack that includes multiple weapons, soldiers, and a premium account. Now back to the world's biggest and most powerful sniper rifles in service today.
The first few up include rifles chambered in the vaunted .338 Lapua round. The original designers envisioned the .338 Lapua round to be the perfect in-between round of the standard 7.62 by 51mm NATO round and the larger 50 caliber round. The military was looking for a lightweight and accurate round, like the 7.62 by 51mm, but had a punch that was just below a 50 cal cartridge. The end result was the .338 Lapua. Unfortunately for Research Armament Industries, the company that designed the round during the 80s, the brass casings meant to hold the powder and bullet were not strong enough to resist the massive amount of pressure produced when firing it. It wasn't until the late 90s, when they partnered with several European firms, that the .338 Lapua became what it is today. After correcting the design issues with the casing, militaries worldwide scrambled to produce rifles that could fire the round. Arguably, the most famous of these was the Accuracy International AWM sniper rifle. First designed and manufactured in the 80s, the UK-based company Accuracy International wanted to make an affordable, highly customizable, and reliable sniper rifle that could be exported worldwide. Initially chambered in the 7.62 by 51mm round, the company started producing the .338 Lapua models in the late 90s. Numerous countries have adopted the .338 Lapua models, but the most famous examples were the L115 model rifles in service with the British and Canadian militaries. Its simple and well-balanced design of an aluminum body with a free-floating barrel and an adjustable pressure trigger has made it one of the most popular long-range sniper rifles in the world. In fact, the rifle has the record for the third longest confirmed sniper kill in history. But the UK is not the only country to build sniper rifles around the .338 Lapua round. Germany created the DSR-1 sniper rifle as a shorter-range precision weapon for Germany's elite police forces. Its ambidextrous design, easily removable scope, and light weight have made it popular among numerous world police agencies and militaries for use in urban environments. American rifle manufacturer Remington also built a sniper rifle designed to take down longer-range targets using this round. Known as the Remington MSR, short for Modular Sniper Rifle, the U.S. Army worked with the company to specially design armor-piercing ammunition to take out enemy combatants wearing body armor up to 1,500 meters. Not only have the U.S. Special Forces adopted the rifle for use, but countries like Algeria, Brazil, and France have also issued it to their troops. The next set of rifles on this list are chambered in the venerated 50 caliber BMG rounds. The 50 caliber round has been around for over 100 years. Still, it wasn't until the American rifle company Barrett designed its first long-range sniper rifle and anti-material rifle in the 1980s that its popularity took off. In 1989, the Barrett Rifle Company introduced the world's first semi-automatic 50 caliber sniper rifle to the market. First purchased by the Swedish Army, the U.S. military soon adopted it in 1990 as its preferred long-range sniper and anti-material rifle. Weighing in at almost 30 pounds, the M82 Barrett is remarkably well-controlled and easy to handle for being such a large-caliber rifle. The rifle's versatility has garnered it much praise in the battlefield and in the hands of numerous police agencies. The gun is so popular that it's used by dozens of countries worldwide and has seen action in every war since the Gulf War in 1991. Despite holding numerous world records for extreme-range sniper shots, soldiers made 3 of the world's top 5 longest kills with another 50 caliber rifle, the Macmillan TAC-50. Produced in Arizona and built since 2000, this bolt-action 50 caliber rifle is regarded as one of the world's most powerful but also the most deadly. 3 of the top 5 longest range kills in history, including the absolute world record at an astounding 3,871 yards, were all made with this rifle. The rifle is much more accurate due to the theory behind its design. Unlike the M82, the engineers that made the Macmillan TAC-50 wanted the user to only be the world's top trained snipers. Though top snipers fired the M82, even regular soldiers can use it in combat, assigned to lightly armored vehicles and hardened positions. Since the M82 is mass-produced, perhaps its tolerances are a little bit looser than the Macmillan, which the company manufactures only in small quantities for the world's most elite snipers. Regardless of its performance against the M82, the Macmillan TAC-50 has proven to be one of the world's most extraordinary sniper rifles. Though the rifle can be chambered in other rounds like the .338 Lapua, as commonly used by American sniper Chris Kyle, it's more common to find it chambered in a 50 caliber BMG. The remainder of the sniper rifles on this list are anti-material rifles, but that has not stopped most of the militaries from using them in long-range sniping capacities, especially in countries like Russia, China, Serbia, and South Africa. Of all the countries over the past 30 years that have made colossal sniper rifles, no one has put more effort into it than Russia. Starting with the KSV-K, which was first produced in 1999, and chambered in the massive 12.7 by 108 mm round. This round has been in the Russian inventory since before World War II and was initially designed to be an anti-aircraft round. For comparison, the 12.7 by 108 mm is slightly more substantial than a 50 caliber round, but less ergonomic than it. Though the Russians had numerous anti-tank rifles made before World War II, these became obsolete with the production of more powerful anti-tank rocket launchers, like the RPG. However, the Russian war in Chechnya in the early 90s convinced them of the need for infantry to have a sniper rifle capable of penetrating buildings and vehicles to hit insurgents in urban areas. Within a year, Russia created the new and improved semi-automatic version of the rifle called the OSV-96. Contrary to popular belief, this rifle was not released in 1996. That was when the design process started. The main reason the KSVK came out first was the need for the rifle when the Second Chechen War erupted in August of '99. Russian military leadership decided the bolt-action version was easier to finish while they waited on the semi-automatic version to be finalized. The most recent heavy Russian sniper rifle to come out was the SVDK, introduced in 2006. This rifle became Russia's answer to the proliferation of the .338 Lapua chambered rifles common among Western and Western allied nations. Based on the wildly popular Dragunov sniper rifle, the SVDK is part of this family of rifles. However, what makes it different is the round it fires. Shooting the 9.3 by 64 mm Bernicki round, this 1920s-era big game hunting cartridge has been the round of choice to penetrate any type of body armor Western soldiers could wear. Though its stopping power is immense and comparable to the .338 Lapua, its accuracy is not as desirable. With only an effective range of 600 meters, troops outside this limit can be considered safe from it. Russia is not the only European country producing powerful sniper rifles. Surprisingly, the tiny Eastern European country of Serbia has been hitting far above its weight for decades with its wildly successful M93 Black Arrow rifle, manufactured by state-controlled arms company Zastava. Zastava designed this bolt-action rifle around the same 12.7 by 108 mm round that the Russian KSVK uses. This was because this ammunition was widespread type of anti-material round a lot of Eastern Bloc countries had lying around that needed a useful purpose. The Serbian military found that with this rifle, they incorporated the best aspects of numerous European heavy sniper rifles, like the German Tankgewehr, and infantry rifles like the Soviet SVT-40. The result was a simplistic yet accurate export model that was also chambered in a 50 caliber BMG. Because of this, the M93 Black Arrow quickly became one of the world's preferred long-range sniping and anti-material rifles among developing nations, with the rifle seeing combat in Liberia, Libya, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and other austere locations. Producing huge sniper rifles is not a skill limited to just European or Western nations, and China has made its own domestic copy of the M82 Barrett since 2006, known as the QBU-10. Chambered in the same round as the M93 Zastava and SVDK, the QBU-10 is a semi-automatic version with a magazine capacity of 5 rounds and an effective range of 2,000 meters. But to give this old round more power, the Chinese military developed an improved version that makes the round punch through armored vehicles with ease. The only other country on the Eurasian continent to produce a rifle like the Chinese has been Iran. Using the same round, the Shaher anti-material rifle has been in Iran's inventory for the past 10 years. But unlike its Chinese counterpart, this rifle has seen plenty of combat use. The Iranians gave an undisclosed number to Taliban forces who used them to deadly effect against the Afghan government. Iranian-backed militias also used them against ISIS fighters in Iraq. But unlike the Chinese rifle, this one is bolt-action, and though the Iranians claim it can take a man out at distances of up to 2.5 miles, this feat has not yet been proven in combat. However, its ability to take out helicopters and light armored vehicles is not questioned, since the round has done so in numerous conflicts. Despite stiff competition from other countries, South Africa has outgunned everyone else in the world with their own line of powerful rifles. Known as the Denel NTW-20, this massive rifle has been the anti-material and long-range sniper rifle of choice since the late 90s. Firing the powerful 20mm round, this rifle fires the same type of round that the U.S. Navy's close-in weapon system fires against incoming missile threats. Weighing in at almost 70 pounds, this rifle is designed to be carried and operated in teams of 2. Though the largest caliber round it can fire is the 20mm anti-aircraft round, the South African military made a smaller caliber barrel and receiver that operators could change out to fire the 14.5 by 114mm round. This round is of Soviet origin and was the same one fired by the vaunted PTRD and other early Soviet anti-material rifles,
But unlike the Russians, the South Africans have actively employed this version as a long-range sniper rifle, with the 8th longest recorded kill in history coming from a South African special operator fighting in the Congo back in 2013 from almost a mile and a half away. Enemies all around, getting closer and closer, and your trusted weapon malfunctions, leaving you defenseless. This is the reason the US Army hates the M4. This was the case for US troops on July 13, 2008, when they faced weapons malfunctions during an attack on the relatively new US outpost near the village of Wanat, located in Afghanistan's province of Kunar that borders the Pakistani border. Nearly 200 Afghan insurgents attacked the outpost, and an unknown number of militants got inside. In one reported case, Staff Sergeant Eric Phillips recounted that his M4 carbine jammed, after which he quickly grabbed a machine gun, but that didn't work either. This resulted in the deadliest attack on US forces in 3 years. But why did this happen? While the M16 was the preferred firearm for US troops since the Vietnam War, the M4A1 5.56mm carbine is now the standard issue firearm for most units in the US military. The latest member of the M16 family, the M4 carbine is a lightweight, gas-operated, air-cooled, magazine-fed, selective-rate shoulder-fired weapon. So how does the M4 differ from the M16? First, the M16 has a standard barrel length of 16 inches, while the M4 comes with a barrel length of 14.5 inches standard. This made the rifle lighter, among other things, and led to the adoption of the M4 over the M16 in the mid-90s. Secondly, while both rifles accept any standard STANAG magazine, like GI Mags, PMags, Lancer, or DD, the M16 usually has a solid stationary stock, while on the M4 the stock is usually collapsible. A third difference is the gun's design. The standard M16 came with a handle on top, used for carrying purposes, and even mounting specialized shooting glass. Now, the M4s usually come flat-topped with some sort of rail system, the M1913 Picatinny, Keymod, or M-Lock, making it more apt for tactical applications. For decades, the Army has known that the M16 rifle and M4 carbine are both plagued by some flawed operating systems that make the weapons jam easily. On top of that, a major issue with the M4 is a defect that allows it to discharge a round without actually pulling the trigger. Despite the higher-ups knowing about these flaws, the US Army still chose to purchase an additional 66,450 M4s. But what about the troops on the ground? Are they happy with the weapon? In a survey conducted by the Center of Naval Analysis, 917 soldiers who used the M4 carbine in combat reported an 89% overall satisfaction in the weapon, although only 80% reported confidence that the M4 will fire without malfunction in combat. The report adds that those who attached accessories to their weapon were more likely to experience stoppages, regardless of how the accessories were attached. While those numbers might not be the worst, would you be confident going into combat with a 19% chance that your weapon would malfunction at some point? In the news and articles, we often hear a weapon jammed or some such nondescript statement that tells us nothing more besides the fact that your rifle didn't fire. So before we get into specific firing flaws of the M4 carbine, let's talk about some types of ways a weapon can malfunction. To be able to correct malfunctions and, more importantly, prevent them, the operator must be able to identify why these occurred. To do so, soldiers are trained to look for specific factors that contribute to malfunctions. Failure to properly load your firearm is the most common cause of malfunctions. In most cases, this comes about due to an improperly loaded magazine, with the most common mistake being putting 31 rounds into a 30-round magazine, preventing it from seating well. If you do hammer the extra round in, it'll do damage to the feed lips, which will cause the rifle to malfunction on the first shot due to the extreme pressure on the bottom of the bolt carrier by that 31st round. Faulty magazines will also lead to the same problem, as a weak spring will mean that the round cycling process will malfunction. This can cause double feeds, where a live round is trying to occupy the same space as a spent cartridge that was not extracted, or a true double feed, where 2 live bullets are pushed into the chamber at the same time. We don't have to mention how unsafe that is. These malfunctions can also happen due to a bad extractor or ejector, not enough lube, or even a defect in some gas-operating weapons not cycling all the way. This is why a firearm should be treated like a machine or a car. Proper maintenance should be performed at every opportunity to function optimally in different circumstances. Environmental factors like cold temperature, outside influences like sand or salt, and high humidity can wreak havoc on any machine. In these situations, weapon maintenance schedules should be modified and preventative maintenance performed more frequently, as each environment poses different challenges. To ensure a gun runs well, you have to adapt to how you take care of each piece of the weapon system. Another important but less common factor that leads to malfunction is the quality of ammo. using improperly manufactured or environmentally damaged ammunition is inevitable, but we don't see it happen as modern ammo storage and manufacturing usually prevents this. Despite malfunctions, the M4-M16 family is both praised and criticized for its current performance in the field. Recognizing issues with the weapon, the Army is pursuing a two-phase PIP or Product Improvement Proposal Plan to keep the M4 carbine inventory strong. Phase 1 upgrades the Army's M4s to the Special Forces M4A1, while Phase 2 explores future improvements to the M4A1 carbine to deliver enhanced reliability, durability, ergonomics, and zero retention. The military is conducting extensive testing of the M4 carbine to identify major issues with the weapon, so improvements can be made accordingly. In recent years, the M4 finished dead last, or close to dead last, in multiple competitions, testing its reliability in the field. Even in competitions where special ammo and magazines were used to make the weapon shine, the Army abruptly stopped the process once again, stating they would only switch to another weapon platform if they could prove the new gun would be twice as good as the M4. The M4 has a reputation as an excellent weapon, if you can maintain it. Failure to maintain the weapon meticulously can lead to jams, especially in sandy or dusty environments. The original military order for the Colt-manufactured M4 carbine in the mid-1900s was a small-scale order to equip units who would otherwise have relied on less accurate 9mm submachine guns. The direct development and sole source contract status raised little fuss, and subsequent contracts also raised little scrutiny. So why do many people feel the M4 has failed the American troops? Extended combat in dusty, sandy environments that highlighted the weapon's weak points as well as its comparative strengths, leading to escalating volumes of complaints. This has been made more obvious by the emergence of alternatives that preserve those strengths while addressing those weak points and what many perceive as a waste of money on the M4 program. With both praise and complaints for the rifle, the Army Times magazine tackled the controversial carbine using results from the 2003 Project Manager Soldiers' Weapons Assessment Team's report that concluded that the executive summary said that M16s and M4s functioned reliably in the combat zone as long as soldiers conducted daily operator maintenance and applied a light coat of lubricant. However, to soldiers with their lives on the line, reliability standards are of utmost importance. A faulty weapon in combat can mean the difference between returning home safely or in a body bag. A 3rd Infantry Division soldier said, "I know it fires very well and accurate when clean, but sometimes it needs to fire dirty well too." Another soldier from the 25th Infantry Division said, "The M4 weapon in the deserts of Iraq and Afghanistan was quick to malfunction when little sand got in the weapon. Trying to keep it clean, sand-free was impossible while on the patrols or firefights." While a member of the 75th Ranger Regiment had this to say, "Even with the dust cover closed and magazine in the well, sand gets all inside, on and around the bolt. It still fires, but after a while the sand works its way all through the gun and jams start." Getting so much heat from issues with the carbine, the Army had to act and do something about it. Since the weapon's introduction, the Army has already made over 90 performance engineering change proposals to the M4 carbine, with improvements being made to the trigger assembly, extractor spring, recoil buffer, barrel chamber, magazine, and bolt. Ergonomic changes were also made to allow soldiers to tailor the rifle according to their needs. For example, U.S. Special Operations Command (SOCOM) has been using the M4A1 AR-15 style firearm variant since 2005. Features of this variant include the RIS-2 Picatinny quad rail, a handrail with one of the more heavy-duty mounts that's said to not decrease performance. As the U.S. Special Operations Command frequently uses the M4 carbine SOP mod version, the Delta Force turned to German defense company Heckler & Koch for a fix that would preserve the M4 but remove problems that led to heat buildup and gas from its operating mechanism that dries out some lubricants and opens the way for sand damage. H&K replaced Colt's gas tube system with a short-stroke piston system that eliminates carbon blowback into the chamber and reduces the heat problem created by the superhot gases used to cycle the M4. Other changes were made to the magazine, barrel, etc. The final product was an M4 with a new upper receiver and magazine, plus Heckler & Koch's 4-rail system of standard Picatinny rails on the top, bottom, and both sides for easy addition of anything a special operator might require. With much room for improvement, it's clear why so many soldiers actually hate the M4 carbine. Despite having gained a reputation for malfunctioning, it isn't likely the U.S. military will be phasing out this rifle anytime soon. Hopefully, appropriate changes will be made to the M4 carbine, making it a more reliable rifle that will back soldiers and work when needed most. Dying for one's country is a noble thing, but dying on a technicality and error shouldn't happen. After the flawed M4, let's up the ante and go for some more firepower. Check out the most lethal modern military weapons.